and to avoid condemning the father with whom he lived and on whom he was dependent, and above all to avoid giving way to sentimentality, which he considered so degrading, Stereo should try not to look at his uncle who would come to disturb his peace of mind, and not to think of what he recalled to him. But when Stefan Katovich, going out after him, saw him on the stairs and calling to him, asked him how he spent his playtime at school, Stereo should talk more freely to him. Away from his father's presence, "We have railway now," he said in answer to his uncle's question. "It's like this, do you see, to sit on a bench there the passengers, and one stands up straight on the bench, and all are harnessed to it by their arms or by their belts, and they run through all the rooms, the doors are left open beforehand well, and it's pretty hard work being the conductor. That's the one that stands step on her card. If it's inquired smiling, yes, you want pluck for it. And cleverness too, especially when they stop all of a sudden, or someone falls down. Yes, that must be a serious matter," said Stepan Herkardovich, watching with mournful interest the eager eyes like his mother's, not childish now, no longer fully innocent. And though he had promised Alexei Alexandrovich not to speak of Anna, he could not restrain himself. "Do you remember your mother?" he asked suddenly. "No, I don't," Seriosha said quickly. He blushed crimson, and his face clouded over. And his uncle could get nothing more out of him. His tutor found his pupil on the staircase half an hour later, and for a while he could not make out whether he was ill-tempered or crying. "What is it? I expect you hurt yourself when you fell down," said the tutor. "I told you it was a dangerous game, and we shall have to speak to the director. If I had hurt myself, nobody should have found it out, that's certain." "Well, what is it then? Leave me alone. If I remember, or if I don't remember, what business is it of his? Why should I remember? Leave me in peace," he said, addressing not his tutor, but the whole world. Chapter 20. Stepan Rakatovich, as usual, did not waste his time in Petersburg. Besides business, his sister's divorce, and his coveted appointment, he wanted, as he always did, to freshen himself up, as he said, after the mustiness of Moscow. In spite of its cafes, chantons, and its omnibuses, Moscow was yet a stagnant bog. Stepan Herkard, which always felt it, and living for some time in Moscow, especially in close relations with his family, he was conscious of a depression of spirits. After being a long time in Moscow without a change, he reached a point when he positively began to be worrying himself over his wife's ill humor and reproaches over his children's health and education, and the petty details of his official work. Even the fact of being in debt worried him, but he had only to go and stay a little while in Petersburg, in the circle there in which he moved, where people really lived, instead of vegetating as in Moscow, and all such ideas vanished and melted away at once like wax before the fire. His wife, only that day he had been talking to Prince Chechinsky. Prince Chechinsky had a wife and family, grown-up pages in the corps, and he had another illegitimate family of children also. Though the first family was very nice to Prince Chechinsky, felt happier in his second family, and used to take his eldest son with him to his second family, and told Stefan Katewitz that he thought it was good for his son, enlarging his ideas. What would have been said to that in Moscow, his children and Petersburg children did not prevent their parents from enjoying life. The children were brought up in schools, and there was no trace of the wild idea that prevailed in Moscow in Lvov household, for instance, that all the luxuries of life were for the children, while the parents have nothing but work and anxiety. Here people understood that a man is in duty bound to live for himself, as every man of culture should live his official duties. Official work here was not the stiff, hopeless drudgery that it was in Moscow. Here there was some interest in official life, a chance meeting, a service rendered, a happy phrase, a knack of facetious mimicry, and a man's career might be made in a trace. So it had been with Briancev, whom Stefan Kadovich had met the previous day, and who was one of the highest functionaries in government. Now there was some interest in official work, like that. The Petersburg attitude on peculiar matters had an especially soothing effect on Stepan Akatovich Bartniansky, who must spend at least 50,000 to judge by the style he lived in, had made an interesting comment the day before on that subject. As they were talking before dinner, Stepan Katovich said to Bartniansky, "You're friendly, I fancy, with Mordvinsky. You might do me a favor, say a word to him, please, for me. There's an appointment. I should like to get secretary of the agency. Oh, I can't remember all that if you tell it to me, But what possesses you to have to do with railways? And Jews, take it as you will, to low business. Stepan Arkadyevich did not say to Bartniansky that it was a growing thing. Bartniansky would not have understood that. I want the money. I have nothing to live on. You're living, aren't you? Yes. But in debt are you, though? Heavily, said Bartniansky sympathetically. Very heavily. 20,000. Bartniansky broke into good-humored laughter. A lucky fellow, he said. My debts mount up to $1.5 million, and I've nothing, and still I can live, as you see. And Stepan Arkadyevich saw the correctness of this view, not in words only, but in actual fact. Zivahov owed 300,000 and hadn't a farthing to bless himself with, and he lived, and in style to come. Kritsov was considered a hopeless case by everyone, and yet he kept two mistresses. Petrovsky had run through 5 millions and still lived in just the same style, and was even a manager in the financial department with a salary of 20,000. But besides this, Petersburg had physically an agreeable effect on Stepan Arkadyevich. It made him younger. In Moscow, he sometimes found a gray hair in his head. Dropped to sleep after dinner, stretched, walked slowly upstairs, breathing heavily, was bored by the society of young women, and did not dance at balls. In Petersburg, he always felt 10 years younger. His experience in Petersburg was exactly what had been described to him on the previous day by Prince Pyotr Oblonsky, a man of 60, who had just come back from abroad. We don't know the way to live here, said Pyotr Oblonsky. I spent the summer in Baden, and you wouldn't believe it. I felt quite a young man at a glimpse of a pretty woman. My thoughts: one dines and drinks a glass of wine and feels strong and ready for anything. I came home to Russia, had to see my wife, and what's more, go to my country place, and there, you'd hardly believe it, in a fortnight I got into a dressing gown and given up dressing for dinner. Needless say, I had no thoughts left for pretty women. I became quite an old gentleman. There was nothing left for me but to think of my eternal salvation. I went off to Paris. I was right as could be at once. Stepan Arkadyevich felt exactly the difference that Pyotr Oblonsky described. In Moscow, he degenerated so much that if he had to be there for long together, he might in good earnest have come to considering his salvation. In Petersburg, he felt himself a man of the world again. Between Princess Betsy Firskaya and Stepan Arkadyevich, there had long existed rather curious relations. Stepan Arkadyevich always flirted with her and jest, and used to say to her also in jest the most unseemly things, knowing that nothing delighted her so much. The day after his conversation with Karenin, Stepan Arkadyevich went to see her, and felt so youthful that in his jesting, flirtation, and nonsense he recklessly went so far that he did not know how to extricate himself, as unluckily he was so far from being attracted by her that he thought her positively disagreeable. What made it hard to change the conversation was the fact that he was very attractive to her, so that he was considerably relieved at the arrival of Princess Myakia, which cut short their tete-a-tete. "Ah, so you're here," she said when she saw him. "Well, and what news of your poor sister? You need to look at me like that," she added. "Ever since they've all turned against her, all those who are 1,000 times worse than she. I thought she did a very fine thing. I can't forgive Bronsky for not letting me know when he was in Petersburg. I'd have gone to see her and gone about with her everywhere. Please give her my love. Come tell me about her." "Yes, sir." "Position is very difficult," she began. Stepan Arkadyevich, in the simplicity of his heart, accepting as sterling coin Princess Myakia's words. "Tell me about her." Princess Miyaki interrupted him immediately, as she always did, and began talking herself. "She's done what they all do except me, only they hide it. But she wouldn't be deceitful, and she did a fine thing, and she did better still in throwing up that crazy brother-in-law of yours. You must excuse me. Everybody used to say he was so clever, so very clever. I was the only one that said he was a fool. Now that he's so thick with Lydia Ivanovna and Landau, they all say he's crazy, and I should prefer not to agree with everybody. But this time I can't help it." "Oh, do please explain," said Stepan Arkadyevich. "What does it mean? Yesterday I was seeing him on my sister's behalf, and I asked him to give me a final answer. He gave me no answer and said he would think it over. But this morning, instead of an answer, I received an invitation from Countess Lydia Ivanovna for this evening." "So that's it," said Princess Myakia gleefully. "They're going to ask Landau what he's to say." "Ask Landau what for? Who or what's Landau? What, you don't know Jules Landau, the fameux Jules Landau, the clairvoyant? He's crazy, do but on him your sister's fate depends. See what comes of living in the provinces. You know nothing about anything. Landau, do you see, was a calm in a shop in Paris, and he went to a doctor's, and in the doctor's waiting room he fell asleep, and in his sleep he began giving advice to all the patients, and wonderful advice. It was then the wife of Yuri Molodinsky. You know, the invalid heard of this Landau and had him to see her husband, and he cured her husband, though I can't say that I see he did him much good, for he's just as feeble a creature as ever he was. But they believed in him and took him along with them and brought him to Russia. Here there's been a general rush to him, and he's begun doctoring everyone. He cured Countess Bazabava, and she took such a fancy to him that she adopted him, yes, as her son. He's not Landau anymore, but Count Bazou. Both that's neither here nor there though. But Lydia, I'm very fond of her, but she's a screw loose somewhere, has lost her heart to this Landau now, and nothing is settled now in her house, or Alexei Alexandrovich is without him, and so your sister's fate is now in the hands of Landau. Alias County Bazubov. Chapter 21. After a capital dinner and a great deal of cognac drunk at Bartniansky, Stepan Arkadovich, only a little later than the appointed time, went in to Countess Lydia Ivanovna's. Who else is with the Countess? A Frenchman, Stefan Koyevich asked the hall porter as he glanced at the familiar overcoat of Alexei Alexandrovich, and a queer, rather artless-looking overcoat with clasps. Alexei Alexandrovich Karanan and Count Bazou both, the porter answered. Severely. Princess Miyakia guessed right, thought Stepan Arkadovich as he went upstairs, curious. It would be quite as well though to get on friendly terms with her. She has immense influence. If she would say a word to Pomorsky, the thing would be a certainty. It was still quite light out of doors, but in contest Lydia Ivanovna's little drawing room the blinds were drawn, and the lamps lighted. At a round table under a lamp sat the Countess and Alexei Alexandrovich talking softly. A short Finnish man, very pale and handsome, with feminine hips and knock-kneed legs, with fine brilliant eyes and long hair lying on the collar of his coat, was standing at the end of the room, gazing at the portraits on the wall. After greeting the lady of the house and Alexei Alexandrovich, Stepan Arkadyevich could not resist glancing once more at the unknown man. Miss Orlando, the Countess addressed him with the softness and caution that impressed Oblonsky, and she introduced them. Landau looked around hurriedly, came up, and smiling laid his moist, lifeless hand in Stepan Arkadyevich's outstretched hand, and immediately walked away, and fell gazing at the portraits again. The Countess and Alexei Alexandrovich looked at each other significantly. I am very glad to see you particularly today, said Countess Lydia Ivanovna, pointing Stepan Arkadyevich to a seat beside Karenin. I introduced you to him as Landau, she said in a soft voice, glancing at the Frenchman. And again immediately after it Alexei Alexandrovich. But he is really Count de Bazou, both, as you're probably aware, only he does not like the title. Yes, I heard so, answered Stepan Arkadovich. You bitch, they say he completely cured Countess Bazabova. She was here today, poor thing, the Countess said, turning to Alexei Alexandrovich. The separation is awful for her, such a blow to her. And he positively is going, queried Alexei Alexandrovich. Yes, he's going to Paris, he heard a voice. Yesterday, said Countess Lydia Ivanovna, looking at Stepan Arkadovich. A voice repeated Oblonsky, feeling that he must be as circumspect as he possibly could in the society, or something peculiar was going on, or was to go on, to which he had not the key. A moment's silence followed, after which Countess Lydia Ivanovna, as they were approaching the main topic of conversation, said with a fine smile to Oblonsky, I've known you for a long while, and I'm very glad to make a closer acquaintance with you, Liz. I mean, do nous aimer so nous aimer. But to be a true friend, one must enter into the spiritual state of one's friend, and I fear that you're not doing so in the case of Alexei Alexandrovich. You understand what I mean, she said, lifting her fine pens of eyes in part. Countess, I understand the position of Alexei Alexandrovich, said Oblonsky, having no clear idea what they were talking about. He wanted to confine himself to generalities. The change is not in his external position. Countess Lydia Ivanovna said sternly, following with eyes of love the figure of Alexei Alexandrovich as he got up and crossed over to Landau. His heart has changed, a new heart has been vouchsafed to him, and I fear you don't fully apprehend the change that is taking place in him. Oh well, in general outlines, I can conceive the change. We have always been friendly, and now, said Stepan Arkadovich, responding with a sympathetic glance to the expression of the Countess, and mentally balancing the question with which of the two ministers she was most intimate so as to know about which to ask her to speak for him. The change that is taking place in him cannot lessen his love for his neighbors. On the contrary, that change can only intensify love in his heart. But I'm afraid you do not understand me. Won't you have some tea? She said, with her eyes indicating the footman, who was handing round tea on a tray. Not quite, Countess, of course. Is misfortune, yes, a misfortune, which has proved the highest happiness. When his heart was made new, was filled full of it, she said, gazing with eyes full of love at Stepan Hrkatovich. I do believe I might ask her to speak to both of them, thought Stepan Hrkatovich. Oh, of course, Countess, he said, but I imagine such changes are a matter so private that no one, even the most intimate friend, would care to speak of them. On the contrary, we ought to speak freely and help one another. Yes, undoubtedly so. But there is such a difference of convictions, and besides, said Oblansky with a soft smile, there can be no difference. Where it is a question of holy truth, oh no, of course. But in Stepan Hrkatovich paused in confusion. He understood at last that they were talking of religion. I fancy he will fall asleep immediately, said Alexei Alexandrovich in a whisper full of meaning, going up to Lydia Ivanovna. Stepan Hrkatovich, which looked around Lando, was sitting at the window, leaning on his elbow in the back of his chair, his head drooping. Noticing that all eyes were turned on him, he raised his head and smiled a smile of childlike artlessness. Don't take any notice, said Lydia Ivanovna, and she lightly moved a chair up for Alexei Alexandrovich. I have observed, she was beginning, when a footman came into the room with a letter. Lydia Ivanovna rapidly ran her eyes over the note and, excusing herself, wrote an answer with extraordinary rapidity, handed it to the man, and came back to the table. I have observed, she went on, that Moscow people, especially the men, are more indifferent to religion than anyone. Oh no, Countess, I thought Moscow people had the reputation of being the firmest in the faith, answered Stepan Hrkatovich. But as far as I can make out, you are unfortunately one of the indifferent ones, said Alexei Alexandrovich, turning to him with a weary smile. How can anyone be indifferent, said Lydia Ivanovna. I am not so much indifferent on that subject as I am waiting in suspense, said Stepan Hrkatovich with his most deprecating smile. I hardly think that the time for such questions has come yet for me. Alexei Alexandrovich and Lydia Ivanovna looked at each other. We can never tell whether the time has come for us or not, said Alexei Alexandrovich severely. We are not to think whether we are ready or not ready. God's grace is not guided by human considerations. Sometimes it comes not to those that strive for it, and comes to those that are unprepared, like Saul. No, I believe it won't be just yet, said Lydia Ivanovna, who had been meanwhile watching the movements of the Frenchman. Landau got up and came to them. Do you allow me to listen? He asked. Oh yes, I did not want to disturb you, said Lydia Ivanovna, gazing tenderly at him. Sit here with us. One has only not to close one's eyes to shut out the light, Alexei Alexandrovich went on. Oh, if you knew the happiness we know feeling his presence ever in our hearts, said Countess Lydia, even over no, with a rapturous smile. But a man may feel himself unworthy sometimes to rise to that height, said Stepan Hrkatovich, conscious of the hypocrisy and admitting this religious height, but at the same time unable to bring himself to acknowledge his free-thinking views before a person who by a single word to Pomorsky might procure him the coveted appointment. That is, you mean that sin keeps him back, said Lydia. Even no, if not. But that is a false idea. There is no sin for believers. Their sin has been atoned for. Pato, she added, looking at the footman, who came in again with another letter. She read it and gave a verbal answer. Tomorrow at the Grand Duchess's say for the believer's sin is not, she went on, yes, but faith without works is dead, said Stepan Hrkatovich, which, recalling the phrase from the Catechism, and only by his smile clinging to his independence there. You have it from the Epistle of St. James, said Alex Alexandrovich, addressing Lydia Ivanovna with a certain reproachfulness in his tone. It was unmistakably a subject they had discussed more than once before. What harm has been done by the false interpretation of that passage? Nothing holds men back from belief like that misinterpretation. I have not works, so I cannot believe, though all the while that is not said, but the very opposite is said, striving for God, saving the soul by fasting, said Countess Lady Ivanovna with disgusted contempt. Those are the crude ideas of our monks. Yet that is nowhere said. It is far simpler and easier, she added, looking at Oblonsky with the same encouraging smile with which at court she encouraged youthful maids of honor disconcerted by the new surroundings of the court. We are saved by Christ, who suffered for us. We are saved by faith. Alexei Alexandrovich chimed in with a glance of approval at her words, who complaining only, as Lydia Ivanovna, and receiving a reply in the affirmative, she got up and began looking through a shelf of books. I want to read him Safe and Happy, or Under the Wing, she said, looking inquiringly at Karenin, and finding the book and sitting down again in her place, she opened it. It's very short, and it is described the way by which faith can be reached, and the happiness above all earthly bliss with which it fills the soul. The believer cannot be unhappy because he is not alone. But you'll see, she was just settling herself to read when the footman came in again. Madame Borodina, tell her tomorrow at 2 o'clock. Yes, she said, putting her finger in the place in the book and gazing before her with her fine pensive eyes. That is how true faith acts. You know, Marisanina, you know about her trouble. She lost her only child. She was in despair. And what happened? She found this comforter. And she thanks God now for the death of her child. Such is the happiness faith brings. Oh yes, that is most, said Stepan Arkadyevitch, glad they were going to read and let him have a chance to collect his faculties. No, I see, I'd better not ask her about anything today. Thought if only I can get out of this without putting my foot in it. It will be dull for you, said Countess Lydia Ivanovna, addressing Landau. You don't know English, but it's short. Oh, I shall understand, said Landale with the same smile, and he closed his eyes. Alexei Alexandrovich and Lydia Ivanovna exchanged meaningful glances, and the reading began. Chapter 22. Stepan Arkadyevitch felt completely nonplussed by the strange talk which he was hearing for the first time. The complexity of Petersburg, as a rule, had a stimulating effect on him, rousing him out of his Moscow stagnation, but he liked these complications and understood them only in the circles he knew, and was at home in these unfamiliar surroundings. He was puzzled and disconcerted, and could not get his bearings as he listened to Countess Lydia Ivanovna, aware of the beautiful, artless, or perhaps artful. He could not decide which eyes of Landau fixed upon him. Stepan Arkadyevitch began to be conscious of a peculiar heaviness in his head. The most incongruous ideas were in confusion in his head. Marisanina is glad her child's dead. How could a smoke would be now to be saved? One need only believe. And the monks don't know how the thing's to be done. But Countess Lydia Ivanovna does know. And why is my head so heavy? Is it the cognac, or all this being so queer? Anyway, I fancy I've done nothing unsuitable so far. But anyway, it won't do to ask her now. They say they make one say one's prayers. I only hope they won't make me. That'll be too imbecile. And what stuff it is she's reading. But she has a good accent. Landau visible. What's he visible for? All at once Stepan Arkadyevitch became aware that his lower jaw was uncontrollably forming a yawn. He pulled his whiskers to cover the yawn and shook himself together. But soon after he became aware that he was dropping asleep, and on the very point of snoring. He recovered himself at the very moment when the voice of Countess Lydia Ivanovna was saying, he's asleep. Stepan Arkadyevitch, which started with dismay, feeling guilty and caught, but he was reassured at once by seeing that the words he's asleep referred not to him, but to Landau. The Frenchman was asleep as well as Stepan Arkadyevitch, but Stepan Arkadyevitch, which is being asleep, would have offended them, as he thought, though even this he thought might not be so, as everything seemed so clear, while Landa's being asleep delighted them extremely, especially Countess Lydia Ivanovna. Monemi, said Lydia Ivanovna, carefully holding the folds of her silk gown so as not to rustle, and in her excitement calling Karenina, not Alexei Alexandrovich, but Monemi Dun Louis Luma, she hissed at the footman as he came in. Again not at home. The Frenchman was asleep, or pretending to be asleep, with his head on the back of his chair, and his moist hand as it lay on his knee made faint movements as though trying to catch something. Alex Alexandrovich got up, tried to move carefully, but stumbled against the table, went up and laid his hand in the Frenchman's hand. Stepan Arkadyevitch, which got up too, and opening his eyes wide, trying to wake himself up. If he were asleep, he looked first at one and then at the other. It was all real. Stepan Arkadyevitch, which felt that his head was getting worse and worse. Tull sucked, repeated the Frenchman impatiently. Same one as PA, and receiving an answer in the affirmative. Stepan Arkadyevitch, forgetting the favor he had meant to ask of Lydia Ivanovna, and forgetting his sister's affairs, caring for nothing but filled with the sole desire to get away as soon as possible, went out on tiptoe and ran out into the street as though from a plague. Stricken house for a long while, he chatted and joked with his cab driver, trying to recover his spirits at the French Theatre, where he arrived for the last act, and afterwards at the Tata restaurant after his champagne. Stepan Arkadovich felt a little refreshed in the atmosphere he was used to, but still he felt quite unlike himself all that evening. On getting home to Peter Blonsky's, where he was staying, Stepan Arkadovich found a note from Betsy. She wrote to him that she was very anxious to finish their interrupted conversation and begged him to come next day. He had scarcely read this note and frowned at its contents when he heard below the ponderous tramp of the servants carrying something heavy. Stepan Arkadovich went out to look. It was the rejuvenated Petro Blansky. He was so drunk that he could not walk upstairs, but he told them to set him on his legs when he saw Stepan Arkadovich, and clinging to him walked with him into his room. And there began telling him how he had spent the evening and fell asleep doing so. Stepan Arkad, which was in very low spirits, which happened rarely with him, and for a long while he could not go to sleep. Everything he could recall to his mind, everything was disgusting, but most disgusting of all, as if it was something shameful, was the memory of the evening he had spent at Countess Lydia Ivanovna's. Next day he received from Alexei Alexandrovich a final answer refusing to grant Anna's divorce, and he understood that this decision was based on what the Frenchman had said in his real or pretended trance. Chapter 23. In order to carry through any undertaking in family life, there must necessarily be either complete division between the husband and wife, or loving agreement when the relations of a couple are vacillating, and neither one thing nor the other. No sort of enterprise can be undertaken. Many families remain for years in the same place, though both husband and wife are sick of it, simply because there is neither complete division nor agreement between them. Both Bronsky and Anna felt life in Moscow insupportable in the heat and dust when the spring sunshine was followed by the glare of summer, and all the trees in the boulevards had long since been in full leaf, and the leaves were covered with dust. But they did not go back to Bozvedenska, as they had arranged to do long before they went on staying in Moscow, though they both loathed it because of late there had been no agreement between them. The irritability that kept them apart had no external cause, and all efforts to come to an understanding intensified it instead of removing it. It was an inner irritation grounded in her mind on the conviction that his love had grown less, in his own regret that he had put himself for her sake in a difficult position, which she, instead of lightening, made still more difficult. Neither of them gave full utterance to their sense of grievance, but they considered each other in the wrong and tried on every pretext to prove this to one another. In her eyes, the whole of him, with all his habits, ideas, desires, with all his spiritual and physical temperament, was one thing: love for women, and that love she felt ought to be entirely concentrated on her alone. That love was less, consequently, as she reasoned, he must have transferred part of his love to other women or to another woman, and she was jealous. She was jealous not of any particular woman, but of the decrease of his love, not having got an object for her jealousy. She was on the lookout for it. At the slightest hint she transferred her jealousy from one object to another. At one time she was jealous of those low women with whom he might so easily renew his old bachelor ties. Then she was jealous of the society women he might meet. Then she was jealous of the imaginary girl whom he might want to marry, for whose sake he would break with her. And this last form of jealousy tortured her most of all, especially as he had unwarily told her in a moment of frankness that his mother knew him so little that she had had the audacity to try and persuade him to marry the young princess Orakina. And being jealous of him, Anna was indignant against him and found grounds for indignation in everything. For everything that was difficult in her position, she blamed him. The agonizing condition of suspense she had passed in Moscow, the tardiness and indecision of Alexei Alexandrovich, her solitude, she put it all down to him. If he had loved her, he would have seen all the bitterness of her position and would have rescued her from it. For her being in Moscow and not in the country, he was to blame too. He could not live buried in the country as she would have liked to. He must have society, and he had put her in this awful position, the bitterness of which he would not see. And Again, it was his fault that she was forever separated from her son. Even the rare moments of tenderness that came from time to time did not soothe her. In his tenderness now she saw a shade of complacency, of self-confidence, which had not been of old, and which exasperated her. It was dusk. Anna was alone and waiting for him to come back from a bachelor dinner. She walked up and down in his study, the room where the noise from the street was least heard, and thought over every detail of their yesterday's quarrel, going back from the well-remembered offensive words of the quarrel to what had been the ground of it. She arrived at last at its origin. For a long while, she could hardly believe that their dissension had arisen from a conversation so inoffensive, of so little moment to either, but so it actually had been. It had arose from his laughing at the girls' high schools, declaring they were useless, while she defended them. He had spoken slightingly of women's education in general, and it said that Hannah and his English protege had not the slightest need to know anything of physics. This irritated Anna. She saw in this a contemptuous reference to her occupations, and she bethought her of a phrase to pay him back for the pain he had given her. "I don't expect you to understand me, my feelings, as anyone who loved me might, but simple delicacy I did expect," she said, and he had actually flushed with fixation and had said something unpleasant. She could not recall her answer, but at that point, with an unmistakable desire to wound her, he had said, "I feel no interest in your infatuation over this girl. That's true, because I see it's unnatural, the cruelty with which she shattered the world she had built up for herself so laboriously to enable her to endure her hard life, the injustice with which he had accused her of affectation, of artificiality, aroused her. I am very sorry that nothing but what's coarse and material is comprehensible and natural to you," she said, and walked out of the room. When he had come into her yesterday evening, they had not referred to the quarrel, but both felt that the quarrel had been smoothed over, but was not at an end. Today he had not been home all day, and she felt so lonely and wretched, and being on bad terms with him, that she wanted to forget it all, to forgive him and be reconciled with him. She wanted to throw the blame on herself and to justify him. "I am myself to blame. I'm irritable. I'm insanely jealous. I will make it up with him and will go away to the country. There I shall be more at peace." Unnatural. She suddenly recalled the word that had stung her most of all, not so much the word itself as the intent to wound her with which it was said. I know what he meant. He meant unnatural, not loving my own daughter, to love another person's child. What does he know of love for children? My love for Seriosha, whom I've sacrificed for him, but that wish to wound me. No, he loves another woman. It must be so. And perceiving that while trying to regain her peace of mind, she had gone round the same circle that she had been round so often before, and had come back to her former state of exasperation, she was horrified at herself. Can it be impossible? Can it be beyond me to control myself? She said to herself, and began again from the beginning. He's truthful, he's honest, he loves me, I love him, and in a few days the divorce will come. What more do I want? I want peace of mind and trust, and I will take the blame on myself. Yes, now when he comes in I will tell him I was wrong, though I was not wrong, and will go away tomorrow, and to escape thinking anymore and being overcome by irritability. She rang and ordered the boxes to be brought up for packing their things for the country. At 10 o'clock Bronsky came in. Chapter 24. Well, was it nice? She asked, coming out to meet him with a penitent and meek expression. Just as usual, he answered, seeing at a glance that she was in one of her good moods. He was used by now to these transitions, and he was particularly glad to see it today, as he was in especially good humor himself. What do I see? Come. That's good, he said, pointing to the boxes in the passage. Yes, we must go. I went out for a drive, and it was so fine. I longed to be in the country. There's nothing to keep you, is there? It's the one thing I desire. I'll be back directly, and we'll talk it over. I only want to change my coat, order some tea. And he went into his room. There was something mortifying in the way he'd said come. That's good, as one says to a child when it leaves off being naughty. And still more mortifying was the contrast between her penitent and his self-confident tone, and for one instant she felt the lust of strife rising up in her again. But making an effort she conquered it, and met Fransky as good-humoredly as before. When he came in she told him, partly repeating phrases she had prepared beforehand, how she had spent the day, and her plans for going away, you know, it came to me almost like an inspiration. She said, why wait here for the divorce? Won't it be just the same in the country? I can't wait any longer. I don't want to go on hoping. I don't want to hear anything about the divorce. I've made up my mind it shall not have any more influence on my life. Do you agree? Oh yes, he said, glancing on Isliat. Her excited face. What did you do? Who was there? She said after a pause. Bronsky mentioned the names of the guests. The dinner was first rate, and the boat race, and it was all pleasant enough, but in Moscow, they can never do anything without something ridicule. A lady of a sort appeared on the scene, teacher of swimming to the Queen of Sweden, and gave us an exhibition of her skill. How did she swim? Asked Anna, frowning. In an absurd red costume, and that as young she was old, and hideous to so. When shall we go? What an absurd fancy. Why did she swim in some special way? Then said Anna, not answering. There was absolutely nothing in it. That's just what I say. It was awfully stupid. Well then, when do you think of going? Anna shook her head as though trying to drive away some unpleasant idea. When? Why, the sooner the better. By tomorrow. We should be ready the day after tomorrow. Yes. Oh no, wait a minute. The day after tomorrow's Sunday. I have to be a mammal, said Bronsky, embarrassed, because as soon as he uttered his mother's name, he was aware of her intent, suspicious eyes. His embarrassment confirmed her suspicion. She flushed hotly and drew away from him. It was now not the Queen of Sweden, swimming mistress, who filled on his imagination, but the young Princess Sarakina. She was staying in a village near Moscow with Countess Franskaya. Can't you go tomorrow? She said. Well, no, the deeds and the money for the business. I'm going there, for I can't get by tomorrow, he answered. If so, we won't go at all. But why so? I shall not go later, Monday or never. What for? Said Bronsky, as though in amazement. Why, there's no meaning in it. There's no meaning in it to you, because you care nothing for me. You don't care to understand my life. The one thing that I cared for here was Hannah. You say it's affectation. Why, you said yesterday that I don't love my daughter, that I love this English girl, that it's unnatural I should like to know what life there is for me that could be natural. For an instant she had a clear vision of what she was doing, and was horrified at how she had fallen away from her resolution. But even though she knew it was her own ruin, she could not restrain herself, could not keep herself from proving to him that he was wrong, could not give way to him. I never said that. I said I did not sympathize with this sudden passion. How is it, though you boast of your straightforwardness, you don't tell the truth? I never boast, and I never tell lies, he said, slowly restraining his rising anger. It's a great pity if you can't respect. Respect was invented to cover the empty space where love should be. And if you don't love me anymore, it would be better and more honest to say so. No, this is becoming unbearable, cried Bronsky, getting up from his chair and stopping short, facing her. He said, speaking deliberately, what do you try my patience for? Looking as though he might have said much more, but was restraining himself. It has limits. What do you mean by that? She cried, looking with terror at the undisguised hatred in his whole face, and especially in his cruel, menacing eyes. I mean to say, he was beginning, but he checked himself. I must ask what it is you want of me. What can I want? All I want is that you should not desert me as you think of doing, she said, understanding all that he had not uttered, but that I don't want that secondary. I want love, and there is none, so that all is over. She turned towards the door. Stop, stop, said Bronsky, with no change in the gloomy lines of his brows. So he held her by the hand. What is it all about? I said that we must put off going for 3 days, and on that you told me I was lying, that I was not an honorable man. Yes, and I repeat that the man who approaches me with having sacrificed everything for me, she said, recalling the words of a still earlier quarrel, that he's worse than a dishonorable man. He's a heartless man. Oh, there are limits to endurance, he cried, and hastily let go her hand. He hates me, that's clear, she thought, and in silence, without looking around, she walked with faltering steps out of the room. He loves another woman, that's even clearer, she said to herself. That she went into her own room. I want love, and there is none. So then all is over. She repeated the word she had said, and it must be ended. But how? She asked herself. If she sat down in a low chair before the looking-glass, thoughts of where she would go now, whether to the aunt who had brought her up to Dolly, or simply alone abroad. And if what he was doing now alone in his study, whether this was the final quarrel or whether reconciliation were still possible. and of what all her old friends at Petersburg would say of her now, and of how Alexei Alexandrovich would look at it, and many other ideas of what would happen now after this rapture came into her head. But she did not give herself up to them. With all her heart, at the bottom of her heart was some obscure idea that alone interested her. But she could not get clear sight of it, thinking once more of Alexei Alexandrovich. She recalled the time of her illness, after her confinement, and the feeling which never left her at that time, "Why didn't I die?" and the words, and the feeling of that time came back to her, and all at once she knew what was in her soul. Yes, it was that idea which alone solved all. Yes, to die, and the shame and disgrace of Alexei Alexandrovich and of Seriosha, and my awful shame. It will all be saved by death, to die, and he will feel remorse, will be sorry, will love me, he will suffer on my account, with the trace of a smile of commiseration for herself. She sat down in the armchair, taking off and putting on the rings on her left hand, vividly picturing from different sides his feelings, after her death, approaching footsteps, his steps distracted her attention. As though absorbed in the arrangement of her rings, she did not even turn to him. He went up to her, and taking her by the hand said softly, "Anna, we'll go the day after tomorrow if you like. I agree to everything." She did not speak. "What is it?" he urged. "You know," she said, and at the same instant, unable to restrain herself any longer, she burst into sobs. "Cast me off," she articulated between her sobs. "I'll go away tomorrow. I'll do more. Am I any moral woman? A stone around your neck. I don't want to make you wretched. I don't want to. I'll set you free. You don't love me. You love someone else." Fran's keepers sought her to be calm and declared that there was no trace of foundation for her jealousy, that he had never ceased and would never cease to love her, that he loved her more than ever. "Anna, why distress yourself and me so?" he said to her, kissing her hands. There was tenderness now in his face, and she fancied she caught the sound of tears in his voice, and she felt them wet on her hand, and instantly Anna's despairing jealousy changed to a despairing passion of tenderness. She put her arms around him and covered with kisses his head, his neck, his hands. Chapter 25. Feeling that the reconciliation was complete, Anna set eagerly to work in the morning, preparing for their departure. Though it was not settled whether they should go on Monday or Tuesday, as they had each given way to the other in a packed, busily, feeling absolutely indifferent whether they went a day earlier or later. She was standing in her room over an open box, taking things out of it, when he came in to see her earlier than usual, dressed to go out. "I'm going off at once to see my mom. She can send me the money by Yegorov, and I should be ready to go tomorrow," he said, though she was in such a good mood. The thought of his visit to his mother's gave her pain. "No, I shan't be ready by then myself," she said, and at once reflected, "So then it was possible to arrange to do as I wished." "No, do as you meant to do. Go into the dining room. I'm coming directly. It's only to turn out those things that aren't wanted," she said, putting something more on the heap of slippery that lay in Anushka's arms. Bronsky was eating his beef steak when she came into the dining room. "You wouldn't believe how distasteful these rooms have become to me," she said, sitting down beside him to her coffee. "There's nothing more awful than these Schönbergachny. There's no individuality in them, no soul. These clocks and curtains, and worst of all, the wallpapers, they're nightmare. I think of those Vizenskas, the promised land. You're not sending the horses off yet?" "No, they'll come after us." "Where are you going to?" "I wanted to go to Wilson's to take some dresses to her, so it's really to be tomorrow," she said in a cheerful voice. But suddenly her face changed. Bronsky's valet came in to ask him to sign a receipt for a telegram from Petersburg. There was nothing out of the way in Bronsky's getting a telegram, but he said, as though anxious to conceal something from her, that the receipt was in his study, and he turned hurriedly to her. "By tomorrow, without fail, I will finish it all." "From whom is the telegram?" she asked. Not hearing him from Steva, he answered reluctantly, "Why didn't you show it to me? What secret can there be between Steva and me?" Fransky called the valet back and told him to bring the telegram. "I didn't want to show it to you, because Steve has such a passion for telegraphing." "Why telegraph when nothing is settled about the divorce?" "Yes, but he says he's not been able to comment anything yet. He has promised a decisive answer in a day or two." But here it is. Read it with trembling hands, and it took the telegram and read what Bronsky had told her. At the end was added a little hope, but I will do everything possible and impossible, I said yesterday, that it's absolutely nothing to me when I get or whether I never get a divorce, she said, flushing crimson. There was not the slightest necessity to hide it from me. So he may hide and does hide his correspondence with women from me. She thought Javang meant to come this morning. With void tops at Fransky, I believe he's won from Pides of all, and more than he can pay, about 60,000. No, she said, irritated by his so obviously showing by this change of subject that he was irritated. Why do you suppose that this news would affect me? So that you must try even to hide it, I said. I don't want to consider it, and I should have liked you to care as little about it as I do. I care about it because I like definiteness, he said. Definiteness is not in the form, but the love, she said, more and more irritated, not by his words, but by the tone of cool composure in which he spoke. What do you want it for, my God? Love again, he thought, frowning. Oh, you know what for. For your sake and your children's in the future. There won't be children in the future. That's a great pity, he said. You want it for the children's sake. But you don't think of me, she said, quite forgetting or not having heard that he had said for your sake and the children's. The question of the possibility of having children had long been a subject of dispute and irritation to her. His desire to have children she interpreted as a proof he did not prize her beauty. Oh, I said, for your sake, above all, for your sake, he repeated, frowning as though in pain, because I am certain that the greater part of your irritability comes from the indefiniteness of the position. Yes, now he has laid aside all pretense and all his cold hatred for me as a parent, she thought, not hearing his words, but watching with terror the cold, cruel judge who looked mocking her out of his eyes. The cause is not that, she said, and indeed I don't see how the cause of my irritability as you call it can be that I am completely in your power. What indefiniteness is there in the position? On the contrary, I am very sorry that you don't care to understand, he interrupted, obstinately anxious to give utterance to his thought. The indefiniteness consists in your imagining that I am free on that score. You can set your mind quite at rest, she said, and turning away from him, she began drinking her coffee. She lifted her cup with her little finger held apart and put it to her lips. After drinking a few sips, she glanced at him, and by his expression she saw clearly that he was repelled by her hand and her gesture and the sound made by her lips. I don't care in the least what your mother thinks and what match she wants to make for you, she said, putting the cup down with a shaking hand. But we are not talking about that. Yes, that's just what we're talking about. And let me tell you that a heartless woman, whether she's old or not old, your mother or anyone else, is of no consequence to me, and I would not consent to know her. Anna, I beg you not to speak disrespectfully of my mother, a woman whose heart does not tell her where her son's happiness and honor lie has no heart. I repeat my request that you will not speak disrespectfully of my mother, whom I respect, he said, raising his voice and looking sternly at her. She did not answer, looking intently at him, at his face, his hands. She recalled all the details of their reconciliation the previous day, and his passionate caresses. They're just such caresses he has lavished and will lavish and longs to lavish on other women. She thought, you don't love your mother. That's all talk and talk and talk, she said, looking at him with hatred in her eyes. Even if so, you must decide. And I have decided, she said, and she would have gone away, but at that moment Yadbin walked into the room and greeted him and remained. Why? When there was a tempest in her soul and she felt she was standing at a turning point in her life, which might have fearful consequences. Why, at that minute she had to keep up appearances before an outsider who sooner or later must know it all. She did not know, but at once quelling the storm within her, she sat down and began talking to their guest. Well, how are you getting on? Has your debt been paid you? She asked Yashvin. Oh, pretty fair. I fancy I shan't get it all, but I shall get a good half. And when are you off? Said Yasmin, looking at Vronsky and unmistakably guessing at a quarrel. The day after tomorrow, I think, said Vronsky. You've been meaning to go so long, though. But now it's quite decided, said Anna, looking Vronsky straight in the face with a look which told him not to dream of the possibility of reconciliation. Don't you feel sorry for that unlucky Pitsov? She went on, talking to Yashvin. I've never asked myself the question, and our God, you have know whether I'm sorry for him or not. You See all my fortunes here. He touched his breast pocket, and just now I'm a wealthy man. But today I'm going to the club, and I may come out of beggar. You see, whoever sits down to play with me, he wants to leave me without a shirt to my back. And so do I him, and so we fight it out. And that's the pleasure of it. Well, but suppose you were married, said Anna. How would it be for your wife? Yajban laughed. That's why I'm not married and never mean to be. And Helsingfors, said Fransky, entering into the conversation and glancing at Anna's smiling face, meeting his eyes, and his face instantly took a coldly severe expression, as though she was saying to him, it's not forgotten, it's all the same, we really in love, she said to your husband, oh heavens, ever so many times. But you see, some men can play, but only so that they can always lay down their cards. When the hour of a rendezvous comes, well, I can take up love, but only so as not to be late for my cards in the evening. That's how I manage things. No, I didn't mean that, but the real thing, she would have said Helsingfors, but would not repeat the word used by Bronsky. Voitov, who was buying a horse, came in, and I got up and went out of the room. Before leaving the house, Fransky went into her room. She would have pretended to be looking for something on the table, but ashamed of making a pretense, she looked straight in his face with cold eyes. What do you want? She asked in French. To get the guarantee for Gambetta. I've sold him, he said in a tone which said more clearly than words, I've no time for discussing things, and it would lead to nothing. I'm not to blame in any way. He thought, if she will punish herself to people hell. But as he was going, he fancied that she said something, and his heart suddenly ached with pity for her. Hey Anna, he queried. I said nothing, she answered just as coldly and calmly. Oh, nothing, don't pee. Then he thought, feeling cold again, and he turned and went out. As he was going out, he caught a glimpse in the looking glass of her face, white, with quivering lips. He even wanted to stop and to say some comforting word to her, but his legs carried him out of the room before he could think what to say. The whole of that day he spent away from home, and when he came in late in the evening, the maid told him that Anna Arkadievna had a headache and begged him not to go into her. Chapter 26. Never before had a day passed in quarrel. Today was the first time, and this was not a quarrel, it was the open acknowledgement of complete coldness. Was it possible to glance at her as he had glanced when he came into the room for the guarantee? To look at her, see her heart was breaking with despair, and go out without a word, with that face of callous composure? He was not merely cold to her, he hated her because he loved another woman. That was clear, and remembering all the cruel words he'd said, Anna supplied to the words that he had unmistakably wished to say and could have said to her, and she grew more and more exasperated. I won't prevent you, he might say. You can go where you like. You were unwilling to be divorced from your husband, no doubt, so that you might go back to him. Go back to him. If you want money, I'll give it to you. How many rubles do you want? And the most cruel words that a brutal man could say, he said to her in her imagination, and she could not forgive him for them, as though he'd actually said them. But didn't he only yesterday swear he loved me? He a truthful and sincere man. Haven't I despaired for nothing many times already, she said to herself afterwards, all that day except for the visit to Wilson's, which occupied 2 hours, and is spent in doubts whether everything were over or whether there were still hope of reconciliation, whether she should go away at once or see him once more. She was expecting him the whole day, and in the evening she went to her own room, leaving a message for him. That her headache, she said to herself, if he comes in spite of what the maid says, it means that he loves me still. If not, it means that all is over, and then I will decide what I'm to do. In the evening she heard the rumbling of his carriage stop at the entrance, his ring, his steps, and his conversation with the servant. He believed what was told him, did not care to find out more, and went to his own room. So then everything was over, and death rose clearly and vividly before her mind as the sole means of bringing back love for her, and his heart of punishing him and of gaining the victory in that strife which the evil spirit in possession of her heart was waging with him. Now nothing mattered, going or not going to Vozvodenska, getting or not getting a divorce from her husband. All that did not matter. The one thing that mattered was punishing him when she poured herself out her usual dose of opium and thought that she had only to drink off the whole bottle to die. It seemed to her so simple and easy that she began musing with enjoyment on how he would suffer and repent and love her memory. When it would be too late, she lay in bed with open eyes by the light of a single burned-down candle, gazing at the carved corners of the ceiling and at the shadow of the screen that covered part of it, while she vividly pictured to herself how he would feel when she would be no more, when she would be only a memory to him. How could I say such cruel things to her, he would say. How could I go out of the room without saying anything to her? But now she is no more. She's gone away from us forever. She is suddenly. The shadow of the screen wavered, pounced on the whole cornice, the whole ceiling. Other shadows from the other side swooped to meet it. For an instant, the shadows flitted back, but then with fresh swiftness, they darted forward, wavered, commingled, and always darkness, death, she thought, and such horror came upon her that for a long while she could not realize where she was, and for a long while her trembling hands could not find the matches and light another candle instead of the one that had burned down and gone out. No, anything only to live. Why, I love him, he loves me, this has been before and will pass, she said, feeling the tears of joy at the return to life were trickling down her cheeks, and to escape from her panic she went hurriedly to his room. He was asleep there, and sleeping soundly. She went up to him, and holding the light above his face, she gazed a long while at him. Now, when he was asleep, she loved him so that at the sight of him she could not keep back tears of tenderness, but she knew that if he waked up he would look at her with cold eyes, convinced that he was right, and that before telling him of her love she would have to prove to him that he had been wrong in his treatment of her. Without waking him, she went back, and after a second dose of opium she fell towards morning into a heavy, incomplete sleep, during which she never quite lost consciousness. In the morning she was waked by a horrible nightmare, which had recurred several times in her dreams, even before her connection with Fransky. A little old man with unkempt beard was doing something, bent down over some iron, muttering meaningless French words, and she, as she always did in this nightmare, it was what made the horror of it felt that this peasant was taking no notice of her, but was doing something horrible with the iron over her, and she waked up in a cold sweat. When she got up the previous day came back to her as though veiled, and missed. There was a quarrel, just what has happened several times. I said I had a headache, and he did not come in to see me. Tomorrow we're going away, I must see him and get ready for the journey, she said to herself, and learning that he was in his study she went down to him. As she passed through the drawing room she heard a carriage stop at the entrance, and looking out of the window she saw the carriage, from which a young girl in a lilac hat was leaning out, giving some directions to the footman, ringing the bell. After a parley in the hall someone came upstairs, and Bronsky's steps could be heard passing the drawing room. He went rapidly downstairs and went again to the window. She saw him come out onto the steps without his hat and go up to the carriage. The young girl and the lilac had handed him a parcel. Bronsky, smiling, said something to her. The carriage drove away. He ran rapidly upstairs again. The mists that had shrouded everything in her soul parted suddenly. The feelings of yesterday pierced the sick heart with a fresh pain. She could not understand now how she could have lowered herself by spending a whole day with him in his house. She went into his room to announce her determination. That was Madame Sarakina and her daughter. They came and brought me the money and the deeds from Mammal. I couldn't get them yesterday. How was your head? Better, he said quietly, not wishing to see and to understand the gloomy and solemn expression of her face. She looked silently, intently at him, standing in the middle of the room. He glanced at her, frowned for a moment, and went on reading a letter. She turned and went deliberately out of the room. He still might have turned her back, but she'd reached the door. He was still silent, and the only sound audible was the rustling of the note paper as he turned it. Oh, by the way, he said at the very moment she was in the doorway, we're going tomorrow for certain. Aren't we? You. But not I, she said, turning around to him. Anna, we can't go on like this. You. But not I, she repeated. This is getting unbearable. You will be sorry for this, she said, and went out, frightened by the desperate expression with which these words were uttered. He jumped up and would have run after her, but on second thoughts he sat down and scowled, setting his teeth. This vulgar, as he thought it, threat of something vague exasperated him. I've tried everything, he thought. The only thing left is not to pay attention. and he began to get ready to drive into town and again to his mother's to get her signature to the deeds. She heard the sound of his steps about the study and the dining room at the drawing room. He stood still, but he did not turn in to see her. He merely gave an order that the horse should be given to Voidtopf. If he came while he was away, then she heard the carriage brought round, the door opened, and he came out again. But he went back into the porch again, and someone was running upstairs. It was a valet running up for his gloves that had been forgotten. She went to the window and saw him take the gloves. Without looking and touching the coachman on the back, he said something to him. Then, without looking up at the window, he settled himself in his usual attitude in the carriage, with his legs crossed and drawing on his gloves. He vanished around the corner. Chapter 27. He is gone. It is over, Anna said to herself, standing at the window, and in answer to the statement, the impression of the darkness when the candle had flickered out and of her fearful dream mingling into one filled her heart with cold terror. No, that cannot be, she cried, and crossing the room, she rang the bell. She was so afraid now of being alone that without waiting for the servant to come in, she went out to meet him. Inquire where the Count has gone, she said. The servant answered that the Count had gone to the stable. His Honor left word that if you cared to drive out, the carriage would be back immediately. Very good. Wait a minute, I'll write a note at once. Send me high with the note to the stables. May haste. She sat down and wrote, I was wrong. Come back home, I must explain. For God's sake, come. I'm afraid. She sealed it up and gave it to the servant. She was afraid of being left alone now. She followed the servant out of the room and went to the nursery. Why, this isn't it, this isn't he. Where his blue eyes, his sweet shy smile, was her first thought when she saw her chubby rosy little girl with black curly hair instead of Stereosha, whom, in the tangle of her ideas, she'd expected to see in the nursery. The little girl sitting at the table was obstinately and violently battering on it with a cork and staring aimlessly at her mother with her pitch-black eyes, answering the English nurse that she was quite well and that she was going to the country tomorrow. Anna sat down by the little girl and began spinning the cork to show her, but the child's loud ringing laugh and the motion of her eyebrows recalled Vronsky so vividly that she got up hurriedly, restraining her sobs, and went awake in it. Be all over. No, it cannot be. She thought, he will come back. But how can he explain that smile, that excitement, after he'd been talking to her? Even if he doesn't explain, I will believe. If I don't believe, there's only one thing left for me, and I can't. She looked at her watch. 20 minutes had passed by now. He has received the note and is coming back not long. 10 minutes more. But what if he doesn't come? No, that cannot be. He mustn't see me with tears-stained eyes. I'll go and wash. Yes, yes, did I do my hair or not? She asked herself, and she could not remember. She felt her head with her hand. Yes, my hair has been done. But when I did it, I can't the least remember. She could not believe the evidence of her hand and went up to the pier glass to see whether she really had done her hair. She certainly had. But she could not think when she had done it. Who's that? She thought, looking in the glass at the swollen face with strangely glittering eyes that looked in a scared way at her. Why, it's I. She suddenly understood, and looking around, she seemed all at once to feel his kisses on her and twitched her shoulders, shuddering. Then she lifted her hands to her lips and kissed it. What is it? Why, I'm going out of my mind. She went into her bedroom, where Anishka was tidying the room. Anishka, she said, coming to a standstill before her, and she stared at the maid, not knowing what to say to her. You mean to go and see Daria Alexandrovna, said the girl, as though she understood. Daria Alexandrovna, yes, I'll go. 15 minutes there, 15 minutes back. He's coming, he'll be here soon. She took out her watch and looked at it. But how could he go away leaving me in such a state? How can he live without making it up with me? She went to the window and began looking into the street, judging by the time he might be back now, but calculations might be wrong, and she began once more to recall when he had started and to count the minutes at the moment when she had moved away to the big clock to compare it with her watch. Someone drove up. Glancing out of the window, she saw his carriage, but no one came upstairs, and voices could be heard below. It was the messenger who would come back in the carriage. She went down to him. We didn't catch the Count. The Count had driven off on the lower city road. What do you say? What she said to the rosy, good-humored me high as he handed her back her note. Why, then he's never received It she thought go with this note, to count his front sky as place you know and bring an answer back immediately, she said to the messenger. And what am I gonna do, she thought. Yes, I'm going to Dolly's, that's true, or else I shall go out of my mind, yes, and I can telegraph too. And she wrote a telegram, I absolutely must talk to you. Come at once. After sending off the telegram, she went to dress. When she was dressed and in her hat, she glanced again into the eyes of the plump, comfortable-looking Anishka. There was unmistakable sympathy in those good-natured little gray eyes. Anishka, dear, what am I to do, said Anna, sobbing and sinking helplessly into a chair. Why fret yourself so in Arkadivna? Why, there's nothing out of the way. You drive out a little and it'll cheer you up, said the maid. Yes, I'm going, said Anna, rousing herself and getting up. And if there's a telegram while I'm away, send it on to Daria Alexandrova's. But no, I should be back myself, yes. I mustn't think I must do something, drive somewhere, and most of all get out of this house, she said, feeling with terror the strange turmoil going on in her own heart, and she made haste to go out and get into the carriage where to ask Pyotr before getting onto the box. Tisna Manka, the Oblonskys, Chapter 28. It was bright and sunny, afire the iron roofs, the flags of the roads, the flints of the pavements, the wheels and leather, the brass and the tin plate of the carriages, all glistened brightly in the May sunshine. It was 3 o'clock, and the very liveliest time in the streets, as she sat in a corner of the comfortable carriage that hardly swayed on its supple springs, while the greys trotted swiftly in the midst of the unseasoned rattle of wheels, and the changing impressions in the pure air. Anna ran over the events of the last days, and she saw her position quite differently from how it seemed at home now. The thought of death seemed no longer so terrible and so clear to her, and death itself no longer seemed so inevitable now. She blamed herself for the humiliation to which she lowered herself. I entreated him to forgive me. I have given in to him. I have owned myself and fault. What for can't I live without him? And leaving unanswered the question how she was going to live without him, she fell to reading the signs on the shop's office and warehouse. Dental surgeon. Yes, I'll tell Dolly all about it. She doesn't like Fransky. I should be sick and ashamed, but I'll tell her she loves me, and I'll follow her advice. I won't give in to him. I won't let him train me as he pleases. Filipov bun shop. They say they send their dough to Petersburg. The Moscow water's so good for it. The springs at me teaching, and the pancakes. And she remembered how long ago, when she was a girl of 17, she had gone with her aunt to Troitsa riding. To was that really me with red hands? How much that seemed to me then splendid and out of reach has become worthless. Well, what I had then is gone out of my reach forever. Could I ever have believed then that I could come to such humiliation? How conceited and self-satisfied he'll be when he gets my note. But I'll show him how horrid that paint smells. Why is it they're always painting and building moldy hope? She read. A man bowed to her. It was Anushka's husband. Our parasites. She remembered how Ronskid said that what's so awful is that one can't tear up the past by its roots. One can't tear it out, but one can hide one's memory of it, and I'll hide it. And then she thought of her past with Alexei Alexandrovich, of how she had blotted the memory of it out of her life. Dolly will think I'm leaving my second husband, and so I certainly must be in the wrong. As if I cared to be right. I can't help it, she said, and wanted to cry, but at once she fell to wondering what those two girls could be smiling about love. Most likely they don't know how dreary it is. Hello, the boulevard, and the children, 3 boys running, playing at horses. Saryosha, and I'm losing everything and not getting him back. Yes, I'm losing everything if he doesn't return. Perhaps he was late for the train and has come back by now, longing for humiliation again. She said to herself, no, I'll go to Dolly and say straight out to her, I'm unhappy. I deserve this. I'm to blame, but still I'm unhappy. Help me. These horses, this carriage, how loathsome I am to myself in this carriage, all of his, but I won't see them again. Thinking over the words in which she would tell Dolly, and mentally working her heart up to great bitterness. And I went upstairs. Is there anyone with her? She asked in the hall. Katerina Alexandrova. 11, answered the footman. Kitty, whom Vronsky was in love with. Thought Anna, the girl he thinks of with love. He's sorry he didn't marry her. Me he thinks of with hatred, and is sorry had anything to do with me. The sisters were having a consultation about nursing when Anna called. Dolly went down alone to see the visitor who had interrupted their conversation. Well, so you've not gone away yet. I meant to have come to you, she said. I had a letter from Steve. Today we had a telegram to answered. Anna looking around for Kitty. He writes that he can't make out quite what Alex Alexandrovich wants, but he won't go away without a decisive answer. I thought you had someone with you. Can I see the letter? Yes, Kitty, said Dolly, embarrassed. She stayed in the nursery. She's been very ill. So I heard. May I see the letter? I'll get it directly. But he doesn't refuse. On the contrary, Steve has hopes, said Dolly, stopping in the doorway. I have it, and indeed I don't wish it, said Anna. What's this? Does Kitty consider it degrading to meet me, thought Anna, when she was alone? Perhaps she's right too. But it's not for her, the girl who was in love with Fransky. It's not for her to show me that even if it is true, I know that in my position, I can't be received by any decent woman. I knew that from the first moment. I sacrificed everything to him, and this is my reward. Oh, how I hate him. And what did I come here for? I'm worse here, more miserable. She heard from the next room the sisters' voices in consultation. And what am I going to say to Dolly now? Amused Kitty by the sight of my wretchedness. Submit to her patronizing? No, and besides, Dolly wouldn't understand, and it would be no good my telling her. It would only be interesting to see Kitty, to show her how I despise everyone and everything, how nothing matters to me now. Dolly came in with the letter. Anna read it and handed it back in silence. I knew all that, she said, and it doesn't interest me in the least. Oh, why so? On the contrary, I have hopes, said Dolly, looking inquisitively at Anna. She had never seen her in such a strangely irritable condition. When are you going away? She asked. Anna, half closing her eyes, looked straight before her and did not answer. Why does Kitty shrink from me? She said, looking at the door and flushing red. Oh, what nonsense. She's nursing and things aren't going right with her, and I've been advising her. She's delighted she'd be here in a minute, said Dolly awkwardly, not clever at lying. Yes, here she is. Hearing that Anna had called, Kitty wanted not to appear, but Dolly persuaded her. Rallying her forces, Kitty went and walked up to her, blushing, and shook hands. I am so glad to see you, she said with a trembling voice. Kitty had been thrown into confusion by the inward conflict between her antagonism to this bad woman and her desire to be nice to her. But as soon as she saw Anna's lovely and attractive face, all feeling of antagonism disappeared. I should not have been surprised if you had not cared to meet me. I'm used to everything. You've been ill. Yes, you are changed, said Anna. Kitty felt that Anna was looking at her with hostile eyes. She ascribed this hostility to the awkward position in which Anna, who had once patronized her, must feel with her now, and she felt sorry for her. They talked of Kitty's illness, of the baby, of Steva, but it was obvious that nothing interested Anna. I came to say goodbye to you, she said, getting up. Oh, when are you going? But again not answering, Anna turned to Kitty. Yes, I am very glad to have seen you, she said with a smile. I've heard so much of you from everyone, even from your husband. He came to see me. I liked him exceedingly, she said, unmistakably with malicious intent. Where's he? He has gone back to the country, said Kitty, blushing. Remember me to him? Be sure you do. I'll be sure to, Kitty said, naively, looking compassionately into her eyes. So goodbye, Dolly, and kissing Dolly and shaking hands with Kitty, Anna went out hurriedly. She's just the same and just as charming. She's very lovely, said Kitty when she was alone with her sister. But there's something peacious about her, awfully peacious. Yes, there's something unusual about her today, said Dolly. When I went with her into the hall, I fancied she was almost crying. Chapter 29. Anna got into the carriage, again in an even worse frame of mind than when she set out from home. To her previous tortures was added now that sense of mortification and of being an outcast which she had felt so distinctly on meeting Kitty. Where to home? asked Peter. Yes, home, she said, not even thinking now where she was going. How they looked at me as something dreadful, incomprehensible, and curious. What can he be telling the other with such warmth, she thought, staring at two men who walked by. Can one ever tell anyone what one is feeling? I meant to tell Dolly, and it's a good thing I didn't tell her. How pleased she would have been in my misery. She would have concealed it, but her chief feeling would have been delight, and my being punished for the happiness she envied me. For Kitty, she would have been even more pleased. How I can see through her. She knows I was more than usually sweet to her husband, and she's jealous and hates me, and she despises me in her eyes. I'm an immoral woman. If I were an immoral woman, I could have made her husband fall in love with me. If I cared to, and indeed I did care to, there's someone who's pleased with himself, she thought as she saw a fat, rubicund gentleman coming towards her. He took her for an acquaintance and lifted his glossy hat above his bald, glossy head, and then perceived his mistake. He thought he knew me well. He knows me as well as anyone in the world knows me. I don't know myself. I know my appetites. As the French say, they want that dirty ice cream. That they do know for certain, she thought, looking at Du Bois, stopping an ice cream seller who took a barrel off his head and began wiping his perspiring face with a towel. We all want what is sweet and nice, if not sweet meats, then a dirty ice, and Kitty's the same, if not Ronsky, then Levin. And she envies me and hates me, and we all hate each other. I kitty me, yes, that's the truth. Tutkin Quafer, a movie. Quafer Park. Tutkin, I'll tell him that when he comes, she thought and smiled, but at the same instant she remembered that she had no one now to tell anything amusing to. And there's nothing amusing, nothing mirthful really. It's all hateful. They're singing for Vespers. And how carefully that merchant crosses himself, as if you were afraid of missing something. Why these churches and the singing and this humbug? Simply to conceal that we all hate each other, like these cab drivers who are abusing each other so angrily. Yajban says he wants to strip me of my shirt, and I am of his. Yes, that's the truth. She was plunged into these thoughts, which so engrossed her that she left off thinking of her own position when the carriage drew up at the steps of her house. It was only when she saw the porter running out to meet her that she remembered she had sent the note and the telegram. Is there an answer? She inquired. I'll see this minute, answered the porter, and glancing into his room, he took out and gave her the thin square envelope of the telegram. I can't come before 10 o'clock, Bronsky, she read. And hasn't the messenger come back? No, answered the porter. Then since it's so, I know what I must do, she said, and feeling a vague fury and craving for revenge rising up within her, she ran upstairs. I'll go to him myself before going away forever. I'll tell him all. Never have I hated anyone as I hate that man, she thought, seeing his hat on the rack. She shuddered with aversion. She did not consider that his telegram was an answer to her telegram, and that he had not yet received her note. She pictured him to herself as talking calmly to his mother and Princess Sarakina, and rejoicing at her sufferings. Yes, I must go. Quickly, she said, not knowing yet where she was going. She longed to get away as quickly as possible from the feeling she had gone through in that awful house. The servants, the walls, the things in that house all aroused repulsion and hatred in her and lay like a weight upon her. Yes, I must go to the railway station, and if he's not there, then go there and catch him. And I looked at the railway timetable in the newspapers. An evening train went at 2 minutes past 8. Yes, I shall be in time. She gave orders for the other horses to be put in the carriage and packed in a traveling bag the things needed for a few days. She knew she would never come back here again. Among the plans that came into her head, she vaguely determined that after what would happen at the station or at the Countess's house, she would go as far as the first town on the Nice-Knee road and stop there. Dinner was on the table. She went up, but the smell of the bread and cheese was enough to make her feel that all food was disgusting. She ordered the carriage and went out the house through a shadow now right across the street. But it was a bright evening and still warm in the sunshine. Anishka, who came down with her things, and Peter, who put the things in the carriage, and the coachman, evidently out of humor, were all hateful to her and irritated her by their words and actions. I don't want you, Peter, but what about the ticket? Well, as you like, it doesn't matter, she said crossly. Peter jumped on the box and, putting his arms at Kimbo, told the coachman to drive to the booking office. Chapter 30. Here it is again. I understand it all, Anna said to herself as soon as the carriage had started, and swaying lightly rumbled over the tiny cobbles of the paved road. And again one impression followed rapidly upon another. Yes, what was the thing I thought of so clearly? She tried to recall it. Cute. Can Queffer know not that? Yes, what Yasmin says. The struggle for existence and hatred is the one thing that holds men together. No, it's a useless journey you're making, she said, mentally addressing a party and a coach, and for evidently going for an excursion into the country. And the dog you're taking with you will be no help to you. You can't get away from yourselves. Turning her eyes in the direction Peter had turned to look, she saw a factory hand almost dead drunk, with hanging head being LED away by a policeman come ease. Found a quicker way, she thought, Count Bronsky, and I did not find that happiness either, though we expected so much from it, and now for the first time on it turned that glaring light in which she was seeing everything onto her relations. With him, which she had hitherto avoided thinking about. What was it he thought in me not love so much is the satisfaction of vanity. She remembered his words, the expression of his face that recalled an abject setter dog in the early days of their connection, and everything now confirmed this. Yes, there was the triumph of success in him, of course there was love too. But the chief element was the pride of success. He boasted of me. Now that's over, there's nothing to be proud of, not to be proud of, but to be ashamed of. He's taken from me all he could, and now I am no use to him. He's weary of me, and is trying not to be dishonorable in his behavior to me. He let that out yesterday. He wants divorce and marriage so as to burn his ships. He loves me, but how the zest is gone. As the English say, that fellow wants everyone to admire him, and is very much pleased with himself, she thought, looking at a red-faced clerk riding on a riding school horse. Yes, there's not the same flavor about me for him now. If I go away from him, at the bottom of his heart he will be glad. This was not mere supposition. She saw it distinctly in the piercing light, which revealed to her now the meaning of life and human relations. My love keeps growing more passionate and egoistic, while his is waning and waning, and that's why we're drifting apart. She went on musing, and there's no help for it. He's everything for me, and I want him more and more to give himself up to me entirely, and he wants more and more to get away from me. We walk to meet each other up to the time of our love, and then we have been irresistibly drifting in different directions, and there's no altering that. He tells me I'm insanely jealous, and I've told myself that I'm insanely jealous, but it's not true. I'm not jealous, but I'm unsatisfied. But she opened her lips and shifted her place in the carriage in an excitement aroused by the thought that suddenly struck her. If I could be anything but a mistress, passionately caring for nothing but his caresses, but I can't, and I don't care to be anything else, and by that desire I rouse aversion in him, and he rouses fury in me, and it cannot be different. Don't I know that he wouldn't deceive me, that he has no schemes about Princess Surakina, that he's not in love with Kitty, that he won't desert me? I know all that, but it makes it no better for me if without loving me from duty he'll be good and kind to me without what I want. That's 1,000 times worse than unkindness. That's hell, and that's just how it is. For a long while now he hasn't loved me, and where love ends hate begins. I don't know these streets at all hells. It seems in still houses and houses, and in the houses always people and people, how many of them, no end, and all hating each other. Come, let me try and think what I want to make me happy. Well, suppose I am divorced, and Alexei Alexandrovich lets me have Seriosha, and I marry Bronsky. Thinking of Alexei Alexandrovich, she had once pictured him with extraordinary vividness, as though he were alive before her, with his mild, lifeless, dull eyes, the blue veins, and his white hands, his intonations, and the cracking of his fingers, and remembering the feeling which exists between them, which was also called love, she shuddered with loathing. Well, I'm divorced and become Vronsky's wife. Well, will Kitty cease looking at me as she looked at me today? No. And will Seriosha leave off asking and wondering about my two husbands? And is there any new feeling I can awaken between Vronsky and me? Is there possible, if not happiness, some sort of ease from misery? No, she answered now without the slightest hesitation. Impossible. We are drawn apart by life, and I make his unhappiness any mine, and there's no altering him or me. Every attempt has been made. The screw has come unscrewed. Oh, a beggar woman with a baby. She thinks I'm sorry for her. Aren't we all flung into the world only to hate each other, and so to torture ourselves and each other? Schoolboys coming laughing. Seriosha, she thought. I thought too that I loved him and used to be touched by my own tenderness, but I have lived without him. I gave him up for another love and did not regret the exchange till that love was satisfied, and with loathing she thought of what she meant by that love, and the clearness with which she saw life now her own, and all men's was a pleasure to her. It's so with me and Peter, and the coachman Theodore, and that merchant, and all the people living along the Volga, where those placards invite one to go, and everywhere, and Always she thought when she had driven under the low-pitched roof of the Nizhegorod station, and the porters ran to meet her a ticket to a Barilovka, said Peter she had utterly forgotten where and why she was going, and only by a great effort she understood the question. Yes, she said, handing him her purse, and taking a little red bag in her hand, she got out of the carriage, making her way through the crowd to the first-class waiting room. She gradually recollected all the details of her position and the plans between which she was hesitating, and again at the old sore places hope and then despair poisoned the wounds of her tortured, fearfully throbbing heart. As she sat on the star-shaped sofa waiting for the train, she gazed with aversion of the people coming and going. They were all hateful to her, and thought how she would arrive at the station, would write him a note, and what she would write to him, and how he was at this moment complaining to his mother of his position, not understanding her sufferings, and how she would go into the room and what she would say to him. Then she thought that life might still be happy, and how miserably she loved and hated him, and how fearfully her heart was beating. Chapter 31. A bell rang. Some young men, ugly and impotent, and at the same time careful of the impression they were making, hurried by Peter to cross the room in his livery and top boots, with his dull animal face, and came up to her to take her to the train. Some noisy men were quiet as she passed them on the platform, and one whispered something about her to another, something vile. No doubt she stepped up on the high step and sat down in a carriage by herself on a dirty seat that had been white, her bag laid beside her, shaken up and down by the springiness of the seat. With a foolish smile, Peter raised his hat with its colored band at the window, and token of farewell an impudent conductor slammed the door in the latch. A grotesque-looking lady wearing a bustle and immensely undressed the woman, and was appalled at her hideousness, and a little girl laughing effectively ran down the platform. Katrina Andreevna, she's got them all, but don't cry. The little girl, even the child's hideous and affected, thought Anna. To avoid seeing anyone, she got up quickly and seated herself at the opposite window of the empty carriage. A misshapen-looking peasant covered with dirt in a cap, from which his tangled hair stuck out all round, passed by that window, stooping down to the carriage wheels. There's something familiar about that hideous peasant, thought Anna, and remembering her dream, she moved away to the opposite door. Shaking with terror, the conductor opened the door and let in a man and his wife. Do you wish to get out? And I made no answer. The conductor and her two fellow passengers did not notice under her veil her panic-stricken face. She went back to her corner and sat down. The couple seated themselves on the opposite side and intently but surreptitiously scrutinized her clothes. Both husband and wife seemed repulsive to Anna. The husband asked would she allow him to smoke, obviously not with a view to smoking, but to getting into conversation with her. Receiving her scent, he said to his wife in French something about caring less to smoke than to talk. They made inane and affected remarks to one another entirely for her benefit. Anna saw clearly that they were sick of each other and hated each other, and no one could have helped hating such miserable monstrosities. A second bell sounded and was followed by moving luggage noise, shouting, and laughter. It was so clear to Anna that there was nothing for anyone to be glad of, that this laughter irritated her agonizingly, and she would have liked to stop up her ears not to hear it. At last the third bell rang. There was a whistle and a hiss of steam, and a clank of chains, and the man in her carriage crossed himself. It would be interesting to ask him what meaning he attaches to that, thought Anna, looking angrily at him. She looked past the lady out of the window with the people who seemed whirling by as they ran beside the train or stood on the platform, the train jerking at regular intervals at the junctions of the rails, rolled by the platform, past a stone wall, a signal box, past other trains, the wheels moving more smoothly and evenly resounded with a slight clang on the rails. The window was lighted up by the bright evening sun, and a slight breeze fluttered the curtain. Anna forgot her fellow passengers, and to the light swaying of the train she fell to thinking again as she breathed the fresh air. Yes, what did I stop at? That I couldn't conceive a position in which life would not be a misery, that we're all created to be miserable, and that we all know it and all invent means of deceiving each Other and when one sees the truth, what is one to do? That's what reason is given man for to escape from what worries him, said the lady in French, lisping effectively and obviously pleased with her phrase. The word seemed an answer to Anna's thoughts. To escape from what worries him, repeated Anna, and glancing at the red-cheeked husband and the thin wife, she saw that the sickly wife considered herself misunderstood, and the husband deceived her and encouraged her in that idea of herself. Anna seemed to see all their history and all the crannies of their souls as it were turning a light upon them, but there was nothing interesting in them. And she pursued her thought, yes, I'm very much worried, and that's what reason was given me for, to escape. So then one must escape. Why not put out the light when there's nothing more to look at, when it's sickening to look at it all? But how? Why did the conductor run along the footboard? Why are they shrieking those young men in that train? Why are they talking? Why are they laughing? It's all falsehood, all lying, all humbug, all cruelty. When the train came into the station, Anna got out into the crowd of passengers and moving apart from them as if they were lepers. She stood on the platform trying to think what she had come here for and what she meant to do. Everything that had seemed to her possible before was now so difficult to consider, especially in this noisy crowd of hideous people who would not leave her alone. One moment porters ran up to her proffering their services. Then young men clacking their heels on the planks of the platform and talking loudly stared at her. People meeting her dodged past on the wrong side, remembering that she had meant to go on further. If there were no answer, she stopped a porter and asked if her coachman were not here with a note from Count Fransky. Count Fransky, they sent up here from the Bronskys just this minute to meet Princess Sarakina and her daughter. And what is the coachman like? Just as she was talking to the porter, the coachman, Miel, red and cheerful, and his smart blue coat and chain, evidently proud of having so successfully performed his commission, came up to her and gave her a letter. She broke it open, and her heart ached before she had read it. I'm very sorry your note did not reach me. I'll be home at 10. Bronsky had written carelessly. Yes, that's what I expected, she said to herself with an evil smile. Very good, you can go home. Then she said softly, addressing Mihaly. She spoke softly because the rapidity of her heart's beating hindered her breathing. No, I won't let you make me miserable, she thought menacingly, addressing not him, not herself, but the power that made her suffer. And she walked along the platform. To maidservants walking along the platform turned their heads, staring at her and making some remarks about her dress. Real, they said, of the lace she was wearing. The young man would not leave her in peace. Again they passed by, peering into her face and with a laugh shouting something in an unnatural voice. The station master coming up asked her whether she was going by train. A boy selling kvass never took his eyes off her. My God, where am I to go, she thought, going farther and farther along the platform. At the end she stopped. Some ladies and children who had come to meet a gentleman and spectacles paused in their loud laughter and talking and stared at her. She reached them. She quickened her pace and walked away from them to the edge of the platform. A luggage train was coming and the platform began to sway, and she fancied she was in the train again. And all at once she thought of the man crushed by the train the day she'd first met Bronsky, and she knew what she had to do. With a rapid light step she went down the steps, that LED from the tank to the rails, and stopped quite near the approaching train. She looked at the lower part of the carriages, at the screws and chains, and the tall cast iron wheel of the first carriage slowly moving up and trying to measure the middle between the front and back wheels, and the very minute when that middle point would be opposite her. There, she said to herself, looking at the shadow of the carriage, at the sand and cold dust which covered the sleepers there in the very middle, and I will punish him and escape from everyone and from myself. She tried to fling herself below the wheels of the first carriage as it reached her, but the red bag, which she tried to drop out of her hand, delayed her, and she was too late. She missed the moment. She had to wait for the next carriage. A feeling such as she had known when about to take the first plunge in bathing came upon her, and she crossed herself. That familiar gesture brought back into her soul a whole series of girlish and childish memories, and suddenly the darkness that had covered everything for her was torn apart, and life rose up before her for an instant with all its bright past joys. But she did not take her eyes from the wheels of the second carriage, and exactly at the moment when the space between the wheels came opposite her, she dropped the red bag and, drawing her head back into her shoulders, fell on her hands under the carriage and lightly, as though she would rise again, at once dropped onto her knees, and at the same instant she was terror-stricken at what she was doing. Where am I? What am I doing? What? For she tried to get up to drop backwards, but something huge and merciless struck her on the head and rolled her on her back. Lord, forgive me all, she said, feeling it impossible to struggle. A peasant muttering something was working at the iron above her, and the light by which she had read the book, filled with troubles, falsehoods, sorrow, and evil, flared up more brightly than ever before. Lighted up for her, all that had been in darkness flickered, began to grow dim, and was quenched forever. Part 8, Chapter 1. Almost 2 months had passed. The hot summer was half over. But Sergei Ivanovich was only just preparing to leave Moscow. Sergei Ivanovich's life had not been uneventful during this time. A year ago he'd finished his book, the fruit of 6 years' labor, sketch of a survey of the principles and forms of government in Europe and Russia. Several sections of this book and its introduction had appeared in periodical publications, and other parts had been read by Sergei Ivanovich to persons of his circle, so that the leading ideas of the work could not be completely novel to the public. But still Sergei Ivanovich had expected that on its appearance his book would be sure to make a serious impression on society, and if it did not cause a revolution in social science, it would at any rate make a great stir in the scientific world. After the most conscientious revision, the book had last year been published and had been distributed among the booksellers, though he asked no one about it. Reluctantly and with feigned indifference answered his friends' inquiries as to how the book was going, and did not even inquire of the booksellers how the book was selling. Sergei Ivanovich was all on the alert, with strained attention, watching for the first impression his book would make in the world and in literature. But a week passed, a second, a third, and in society no impression whatever could be detected. His friends, who were specialists and savants, occasionally, unmistakably from politeness, alluded to it. The rest of his acquaintances, not interested in a book on a learned subject, did not talk of it at all, and society generally, just now especially absorbed in other things, was absolutely indifferent. In the press, for a whole month there was not a word about his book. Sergei Ivanovich had calculated to a nicety the time necessary for writing a review, but a month passed, and a second, and still there was silence. Only in the Northern Beetle, in a comic article on the singer Jabanti, who had lost his voice, there was a contemptuous allusion to Kosnichev's book, suggesting that the book had been long ago seen through by everyone and was a subject of general ridicule. At last, in the third month, a critical article appeared in a serious review. Sergei Ivanovich knew the author of the article. He'd met him once at Golubtsov's. The author of the article was a young man, an invalid, very bold as a writer, but extremely deficient in breeding and shy in personal relations. In spite of his absolute contempt for the author, it was with complete respect that Sergei Ivanovich said about reading the article. The article was awful. The critic had undoubtedly put an interpretation upon the book which could not possibly be put on it, but he had selected quotations so adroitly that for people who had not read the book, and obviously scarcely anyone had read it, it seemed absolutely clear that the whole book was nothing but a medley of high-flown phrases, not even as suggested by marks of interrogation used appropriately, and that the author of the book was a person absolutely without knowledge of the subject. And all this was so wittily done that Sergei Ivanovich would not have disowned such wit himself, but that was just what was so awful. In spite of the scrupulous conscientiousness with which Sergei Ivanovich verified the correctness of the critic's arguments, he did not for a minute stop to ponder over the faults and mistakes which were ridiculed, but unconsciously began immediately trying to recall every detail of his meeting and conversation with the author of the article. Didn't I offend him in some way? Sergei Ivanovich wondered, and remembering that when they had met he had corrected the young man about something he had said that betrayed ignorance, Sergei Ivanovich found the clue to explain the article. This article was followed by a deadly silence about the book, both in the press and in conversation, and Sergei Ivanovich saw that his 6 years' task, toiled at with such love and labor, had gone, leaving no trace. Sergei Ivanovich's position was still more difficult from the fact that since he had finished his book, he had no more literary work to do, such as had hitherto occupied the greater part of his time. Sergei Ivanovich was clever, cultivated, healthy, and energetic, and he did not know what use to make of his energy. Conversations in drawing rooms and meetings, assemblies, and committees everywhere where talk was possible took up part of his time, but being used for years to town life, he did not waste all his energies and talk as his less experienced younger brother did. When he was in Moscow, he had a great deal of leisure and intellectual energy still to dispose of. Fortunately for him at this period, so difficult for him from the failure of his book, the various public questions of the descending sex, of the American alliance, of the Samara famine, of exhibitions, and of spiritualism were definitely replaced in public interest by the Slavonic question, which had hitherto rather languidly interested society, and Sergei Ivanovich, who had been one of the first to raise this subject, threw himself into it heart and soul in the circle to which Sergei which belonged. Nothing was talked of or written about just now, but the Serbian war. Everything that the idle crowd usually does to kill time was done now for the benefit of the Slavonic states: balls, concerts, dinners, matchboxes, ladies' dresses, beer, restaurants. Everything testified to sympathy with the Slavonic peoples. From much of what was spoken and written on the subject, Sergei Ivanovich differed on various points. He saw that the Slavonic question had become one of those fashionable distractions which succeeded one another in providing society with an object and an occupation. He saw, too, that a great many people were taking up the subject for motives of self-interest and self-advertisement. He recognized that the newspapers published a great deal that was superfluous and exaggerated with the sole aim of attracting attention and outbidding one another. He saw that in this general movement, those who thrust themselves most forward and shouted the loudest were men who had failed and were smarting under a sense of injury: generals without armies, ministers not in the ministry, journalists not on any paper, party leaders without followers. He saw that there was a great deal in it that was frivolous and absurd, but he saw and recognized an unmistakable growing enthusiasm uniting all classes, with which it was impossible not to sympathize. The massacre of men who were fellow Christians and of the same Slavonic race excited sympathy for the sufferers and indignation against the oppressors, and the heroism of the Serbians and the Montenegrin struggling for a great cause begot in the whole people a longing to help their brothers, not in word but in deed. But in this there was another aspect that rejoiced Sergei Ivanovich. That was the manifestation of public opinion. The public had definitely expressed its desire. The soul of the people had, as Sergei Ivanovich said, found expression, and the more he worked in this cause, the more incontestable it seemed to him that it was a cause destined to assume vast dimensions, to create an epoch. He threw himself heart and soul into the service of this great cause and forgot to think about his book. His whole time now was engrossed by it, so that he could scarcely manage to answer all the letters and appeals addressed to him. He worked the whole spring and part of the summer, and it was only in July that he prepared to go away to his brothers in the country. He was going both to rest for a fortnight and in the very heart of the people in the farthest wilds of the country, to enjoy the sight of that uplifting of the spirit of the people, of which, like all residents in the capital and big towns, he was fully persuaded. Katavasov had long been meaning to carry out his promise to stay with Levin, and so he was going with him. Chapter to Sergei Ivanovich and Katavaso had only just reached the station of the course line, which was particularly busy and full of people that day. When looking around for the groom, who was following with their things, they saw a party of volunteers driving up in for cabs. Ladies met them with bouquets of flowers, and followed by the rushing crowd, they went into the station. One of the ladies who had met the volunteers came out of the hall and addressed Sergei Ivanovich. "You to come to see them off?" she asked in French. "No, I'm going away myself, princess, to my brothers for a holiday." "Do you always see them off?" said Sergei Ivanovich with a hardly perceptible smile. "Oh, that would be impossible," answered the princess. "Is it true that 800 have been sent from us already?" Marvinsky wouldn't believe me. "More than 800 if you reckon those who've been sent not directly from Moscow. Over 1,000, answered Sergei Ivanovich. "There, that's just what I said," exclaimed the lady, And it's true too, I suppose, that more than 1 million has been subscribed. Yes, Princess, what you say to today's telegram, beating the Turks again, yes. So I saw, answered Sergey Ivanovich. They were speaking of the last telegram stating that the Turks had been for 3 days in succession beaten on all points and put to flight, and that tomorrow a decisive engagement was expected. By the way, a splendid young fellow has asked leave to go, and they've made some difficulty. I don't know why I meant to ask you. I know him. Please write a note about his Casey's being sent by Countess Lydia Ivanovna. Sergey Ivanovich asked for all the details the princess knew about the young man, and going into the first-class waiting room, wrote a note to the person on whom the granting of leave of absence depended and handed it to the princess. You know, Count Fransky, the notorious one, is going by this train, said the princess with a smile full of triumphant meaning, when he found her again and gave her the letter. I had heard he was going, but I did not know when by this train. I've seen him, he's here. There's only his mother seeing him off. It's the best thing anyway that he could do. Oh yes, of course. While they were talking, the crowd streamed by them into the dining room. They went forward to and heard a gentleman with a glass in his hand delivering a loud discourse to the volunteers in the service of religion, humanity, and our brothers. The gentleman said, his voice growing louder and louder, to this great cause. Mother Moscow dedicates you with her blessing, Yevio. He concluded loudly and tearfully. Everyone shouted Yevio, and a fresh crowd dashed into the hall, almost carrying the princess off her legs. Ah, princess. That was something like, said Stepan Narkotovich, suddenly appearing in the middle of the crowd and beaming upon them with a delighted smile. Kapili warmly said, wasn't it bravo? And Sergey Ivanovich, why, you ought to have said something, just a few words, you know, to encourage them. You do that so well, he added with a soft, respectful, and discreet smile, moving Sergey Ivanovich forward a little by the arm. No, I'm just off where to the country, to my brothers, answered Sergey Ivanovich. Then you'll see my wife. I've written to her, but you'll see her first. Please tell her that they've seen me, and that it's all right, as the English say. She understando, and be so good as to tell her I'm appointed secretary of the committee, but she understand you. No, they petite me that I really love you, man. He said that we're apologizing to the princess and Princess Miyakia, not Liza. But Bibish is sending 1,000 guns and 12 nurses. Did I tell you? Yes, I heard so, answered Kosnichev indifferently. It's a pity you're going away, said Stepan Akatovich. Tomorrow we're giving a dinner to 2 who are setting off to Mayor Bartniansky from Petersburg, and our Vislavsky Grisha. They're both going. Vislavskys only lately married. There's a fine fellow for you, a princess. He turned to the lady. The princess looked at Kosnichev without replying, but the fact that Sergey Ivanovich and the princess seemed anxious to get rid of him did not in the least disconcert Stepan Arkadyevich. Smiling, he stared at the feather in the princess's hat, and then about him as though he were going to pick something up. Seeing a lady approaching with a collecting box, he backed her up and put in a 5-ruble note. I can never see these collecting boxes unmoved while I have money in my pocket, he said. And how about today's telegram? Fine chaps, those Montenegrins. You don't say so, he cried when the princess told him that Bronsky was going by this train. For an instant step on our card, which his face looked sad, but a minute later, when stroking his mustaches and swinging as he walked, he went into the hall where Bronsky was. He had completely forgotten his own despairing sob, so for his sister's corpse, and he saw in Bronsky only a hero and an old friend with all of his faults. One can't refuse to do him justice, said the princess to Sergey Ivanovich as soon as Stepan Arkadyevich had left them. What a typical Russian Slav nature, only I'm afraid it won't be pleasant for Bronsky to see him. Say what you will, I'm touched by that man's fate. Do talk to him a little on the way, said the princess. Yes, perhaps, if it happens so. I never liked him, but this atones for a great deal. He's not merely going himself, he's taking a squadron at his own expense. Yes, so I heard. A bell sounded. Everyone crowded to the doors. Here he is, at the princess, indicating Bronsky, who with his mother on his arm walked by, wearing a long overcoat and wide-brimmed black hat. Oblonsky was walking beside him, talking eagerly of something. Bronsky was frowning and looking straight before him as though he did not hear what Stepan Arkadyevich was saying. Probably on Oblonsky's pointing them out, he looked around in the direction where the princess and Sergey Ivanovich were standing, and without speaking lifted his hat. His face aged and worn by suffering looked stony. Going on to the platform, Bronsky left his mother and disappeared into a compartment. On the platform there rang out "God save the Tsar," then shouts of hurrah, and YIVIO. One of the volunteers, a tall, very young man with a hollow chest, was particularly conspicuous, bowing and waving his felt hat and a nosegay over his head. Then two officers emerged, bowing too, and a stout man with a big beard wearing a greasy forge cap. Chapter 3. Saying goodbye to the Princess, Sergei Ivanovich was joined by Katavasov. Together they got into a carriage full to overflowing, and the train started at Saratino station. The train was met by a chorus of young men singing "Hail to the." Again the volunteers bowed and poked their heads out, but Sergei Ivanovich paid no attention to them. He had so much to do with the volunteers that the type was familiar to him and did not interest him. Katavasov, whose scientific work had prevented his having a chance of observing them hitherto, was very much interested in them and questioned Sergei Ivanovich. Sergei Ivanovich advised him to go into the second class and talk to them himself. At the next station, Katavasov acted on this suggestion. At the first stop, he moved into the second class and made the acquaintance of the volunteers. They were sitting in a corner of the carriage, talking loudly and obviously aware that the attention of the passengers and Katavasov as he got in was concentrated upon them. More loudly than all talked to the tall, hollow-chested young man. He was unmistakably tipsy and was relating some story that had occurred at his school. Facing him sat a middle-aged officer in the Austrian military jacket of the guard's uniform. He was listening with a smile to the hollow-chested youth and occasionally pulling him up. The third, in an artillery uniform, was sitting on a box beside them. A fourth was asleep. Entering into conversation with the youth, Katavasov have learned that he was a wealthy Moscow merchant who would run through a large fortune before he was 22. Katavasov did not like him because he was unmanly and effeminate and sickly. He was obviously convinced, especially now after drinking, that he was performing a heroic action, and he bragged of it in the most unpleasant way. The second, a retired officer, made an unpleasant impression upon Katavasov. He was, it seemed, a man who had tried everything. He'd been on a railway, he had been a land steward, he had started factories, and he talked quite without necessity of all he had done and used learned expressions quite inappropriately. The third, the artillery man, on the contrary, struck Katavasov very favorably. He was a quiet, modest fellow, unmistakably impressed by the knowledge of the officer and the heroic self-sacrifice of the merchant, and saying nothing about himself. When Katavasov asked him what had impelled him to go to Serbia, he answered modestly, "Oh well, everyone's going. The Serbians want help too. I'm sorry for them. Yes, you artillery men especially are scarce there," said Katavasov. "Oh, I wasn't long in the artillery. Maybe they'll put me into the infantry or the cavalry." "Into the infantry when they need artillery more than anything," said Katavasov, fancying from the artilleryman's apparent age that he must have reached a fairly high grade. "I wasn't long in the artillery. I'm a cadet retired," he said, and he began to explain how he had failed in his examination. All of this together made a disagreeable impression on Katavasov, and when the volunteers got out of the station for a drink, Katavasov would have liked to compare his unfavorable impression and conversation with someone. There was an old man in the carriage wearing a military overcoat who'd been listening all the while to Katavasov's conversation with the volunteers. When they were left alone, Katavasov addressed him. "What different positions they come from. All those fellows were going off there," Katavasov said vaguely, not wishing to express his own opinion, and at the same time anxious to find out the old man's views. The old man was an officer who had served on 2 campaigns. He knew what makes a soldier, and judging by the appearance and the talk of those persons, by the swagger with which they had recourse to the bottle on the journey, he considered them poor soldiers. Moreover, he lived in a district town, and he was longing to tell how one soldier had volunteered from his town, a drunkard and a thief whom no one would employ as a laborer, but knowing by experience that in the present condition of the public temper, it was dangerous to express an opinion opposed to the general one, and especially to criticize the volunteers unfavorably. He'd watched Katavasov without committing himself. "Well, men are wanted there," he said, laughing with his eyes, and they fell to talking of the last war news, and each concealed from the other his perplexity as to the engagement expected next day, since the Turks had been beaten according to the latest news at all points, and so they parted, neither giving expression to his opinion. Kind of also went back to his own carriage, and with reluctant hypocrisy reported to Sir Gavanovich's observations of the volunteers, from which it would appear that they were capital fellows at a big station. At a town the volunteers were again greeted with shouts and singing again. Men and women with collecting boxes appeared, and provincial ladies brought bouquets to the volunteers and followed them into the refreshment room. But all this was on a much smaller and feebler scale than in Moscow. Chapter 4. While the train was stopping at the provincial town, Sergei Ivanovich did not go to the refreshment room, but walked up and down the platform. The first time he passed Vronsky's compartment, he noticed that the curtain was drawn over the window. But as he passed it the second time, he saw the old countess at the window. She beckoned to Cosmic Chef. "I'm going, you see, taking him as far as Kursk," she said. "Yes, so I heard," said Sergei Ivanovich, standing at her window and peeping in. "What a noble act on his part," he added, noticing that Vronsky was not in the compartment. "Yes, after his misfortune. What was there for him to do? What a terrible thing it was," said Sergei Ivanovich. "Oh, what I've been through. But do get in." "Oh, what I have been through," she repeated. When Sergei Ivanovich had got in and sat down beside her, you can't conceive it, for 6 weeks he did not speak to anyone and would not touch food except when I implored him, and not for 1 minute could we leave him alone. We took everything away could have used. Against himself we lived on the ground floor, but there was no reckoning on anything. You know, of course, that he had shot himself once already on her account," she said, and the old lady's eyelashes twitched at the recollection. Yes, hers was a fitting end for such a woman. Even the death she chose was low and vulgar. "It's not for us to judge, Countess," said Sergei Ivanovich, "but I can understand that it has been very hard for you. Don't speak of it. I was staying on my estate, and he was with me. A note was brought him. He wrote an answer and sent it off. We hadn't any idea that she was close by at the station in the evening. I had only just gone to my room when my Mary told me a lady had thrown herself under the train. Something seemed to strike me at once. I knew it was she. The first thing I said was he was not to be told. But they told him already. His coachman was there and saw it all. When I ran into his room, he was beside himself. It was fearful to see him. He didn't say a word, but galloped off there. I don't know to this day what happened there. But he was brought back at death's door. I shouldn't have known him. Frustration complex, the doctor said. And I was followed almost by madness. A wide talk of it," said the Countess with the wave of her hand. "It was an awful time. No, say what you will, she was a bad woman. Why, what is the meaning of such desperate passions? It was all to show herself something out of the way. Well, and that she did too. She brought herself to ruin and to good men, her husband and my unhappy son." "And what did her husband do?" asked Sergei Ivanovich. "He is taking her daughter." Alexei was ready to agree to anything at first. Now it worries him terribly that he should have given his only child away to another man, but he can't take back his word. Karenin came to the funeral, but we tried to prevent his meeting Alexei for him, for her husband. It was easier anyway. She had set him free. But my poor son was utterly given up to her. He thrown up everything, his career, me, and even then she had no mercy on him. But of set purpose she made his ruin complete. No, say what you will, her very death was the death of a vile woman of no religious feeling. God forgive me, but I can't help hating the memory of her when I look at my son's misery. But how is he now? It was a blessing from Providence for us, this Serbian war. I'm old, and I don't understand the rights and wrongs of it, but it's come as a providential blessing to him. Of course, for me, as his mother, it's terrible. And what's worse, they say Sina Petrabian Wu Petersburg. But it can't be helped. It was the one thing that could rouse him. Yad been a friend of his had lost all he had at cards, and he was going to Serbia. He came to see him and persuaded him to go. Now it's an interest for him. Do please talk to him a little. I want to distract his mind. He's so low-spirited, and his bad luck would have it he has a toothache too, but he'll be delighted to see you. Please do talk to him. He's walking up and down on that side." Sergei Ivanovich said he would be very glad to, and crossed over to the other side of the station. Chapter 5. In the slanting evening Shadows cast by the baggage piled up on the platform. Bronsky, in his long overcoat and slouch hat with his hands in his pockets, strode up and down like a wild beast in a cage, turning sharply after 20 paces. Sergei Ivanovich fancied as he approached him that Bronsky saw him, but was pretending not to see. This did not affect Sergei Ivanovich in the slightest. He was above all personal considerations with Bronsky. At that moment, Sergei Ivanovich looked upon Bronsky as a man taking an important part in a great cause, and Kosmachev thought it his duty to encourage him and express his approval. He went up to him. Bronsky stood still, looked intently at him, recognized him, and going a few steps forward to meet him, shook hands with him very warmly. "Possibly you didn't wish to see me," said Sergei Ivanovich. "But couldn't I be of use to you? There's no one I should less dislike seeing than you," said Bronsky. "Excuse me. And there's nothing in life for me to like, I quite understand, and I merely meant to offer you my services," said Sergei Ivanovich, scanning Bronsky's face full of unmistakable suffering. "Wouldn't it be of use to you to have a letter to restitch to Milan?" "Oh no," Bronsky said, seeming to understand him with difficulty. "If you don't mind, let's walk on. It's so stuffy among the carriages." "A letter? No thank you. To meet death one needs no letters of introduction, nor for the Turks," he said with a smile that was merely of the lips. His eyes still kept their look of angry suffering. "Yes, but you might find it easier to get into relations, which are after all essential, with anyone prepared to see you. But that's as you like. I was very glad to hear of your intention. There have been so many attacks made on the volunteers, and a man like you raises them in public estimation. My use as a man," said Fransky, "is that life's worth nothing to me, and that I have enough bodily energy to cut my way into their ranks and to trample on them or fall. I know that I'm glad there's something to give my life for it's not simply useless, but loathsome to me. Anyone's welcome to it." And his jaw twitched impatiently from the incessant gnawing toothache that prevented him from even speaking with a natural expression. "You will become another man, I predict," said Sergei Ivanovich, feeling touched. "To deliver one's brother men from bondage is an aim worth death in life. God grant you success outwardly, and inwardly peace," he added, and he held out his hand. Bronsky warmly pressed his outstretched hand. "Yes, as a weapon I may be of some use, but as a man I'm a wreck," he jerked out. He could hardly speak for the throbbing ache in his strong teeth that were like rows of ivory in his mouth. He was silent, and his eyes rested on the wheels of the tender, slowly and smoothly rolling along the rails, and all at once a different pain, not an ache, but an inner trouble that set his whole being. An anguish made him for an instant forget his toothache as he glanced at the tender and the rails under the influence of the conversation with a friend he had not met since his misfortune. He suddenly recalled her, that is what was left of her when he had run like one distraught into the cloakroom of the railway station, on the table shamelessly sprawling out among strangers, the blood-stained body, so lately full of life, the head unhurt dropping back with its weight of hair, and the curling tresses about the temples, and the exquisite face with red half-opened mouth, the strange fixed expression hideous on the lips and awful in the still open eyes that seemed to utter that fearful phrase, that he would be sorry for it, that she had said when they were quarreling. And he tried to think of her as she was when he met her the first time at a railway station, to mysterious, exquisite, loving, seeking and giving happiness, and not cruelly revengeful as he remembered her on that last moment. He tried to recall his best moments with her, but those moments were poisoned forever. He could only think of her as triumphant, successful in her menace of a wholly useless remorse, never to be effaced. He lost all consciousness of toothache, and his face worked with sobs, passing twice up and down beside the baggage in silence. And regaining his self-possession, he addressed Sergei Ivanovich calmly. "You have had no telegram since yesterday's?" "Yes, driven back for a third time, but a decisive engagement expected for tomorrow." And after talking a little more of King Milan's proclamation and the immense effect it might have, they parted, going to their carriages on hearing the second bell. Chapter 6. Sergei Ivanovich had not telegraphed to his brother to send to meet him, as he did not know when he should be able to leave Moscow. Levin was not at home when Katavaso and Sergei Ivanovich, in a fly hired at the station, drove up to the steps of the Pokrovska house, as black as Moors from the dust of the road. Kitty, sitting on the balcony with her father and sister, recognized her brother-in-law and ran down to meet him. "What a shame not to have let us know," she said, giving her hand to Sergei Ivanovich and putting her forehead up for him to kiss. "We drove here happily and have not put you out," answered Sergei Ivanovich. "I'm so dirty. I'm afraid to touch you. I've been so busy I didn't know when I should be able to tear myself away. And so you're still as ever enjoying your peaceful, quiet happiness," he said, smiling, "out of the reach of the current in your peaceful backwater. Here's our friend Theodore Vasilyevich, who has succeeded in getting here at last, but I'm not a Negro. I shall look like a human being when I wash," said Katavasov in his jesting fashion, and he shook hands and smiled, his teeth flashing white in his black face. "Costa will be delighted. He's gone to his settlement. It's time he should be home, busy as ever with his farming. It really is a peaceful backwater," said Katavasov, "while we in town think of nothing but the Serbian war. Well, how does our friend look at it? He's sure not to think like other people." "Oh, I don't know, like everybody else," Kitty answered, a little embarrassed, looking around at Sergei Ivanovich. "I'll send to fetch him. Papa's staying with us. He's only just come home from abroad and making arrangements to send for Levin and for the guests to wash, one in his room and the other in what had been Dolly's, and giving orders for their luncheon." Kitty ran out onto the balcony, enjoying the freedom and rapidity of movement of which she had been deprived during the months of her pregnancy. "At Sergei Ivanovich and Katavaso, a professor," she said. "Oh, that's a bore in this heat," said the prince. "No, Papa. He's very nice, and Costa is very fond of him," Kitty said with a deprecating smile, noticing the irony on her father's face. "Oh, I didn't say anything. You go to them, darling," said Kitty to her sister, "and entertain them. They saw Steve at the station. He was quite well, and I must run to meet you. As ill luck would have it, I haven't fed him since tea. He's awake now and sure to be screaming." And feeling a rush of milk, she hurried to the nursery. This was not a mere guess. Her connection with the child was still so close that she could gauge by the flow of her milk his need of food, and knew for certain he was hungry. She knew he was crying before she reached the nursery, and he was indeed crying. She heard him and hastened, but the faster she went, the louder he screamed. It was a fine, healthy scream, hungry and impatient. "Has he been screaming long, nurse?" "Very long," said Kitty, hurriedly seating herself on a chair and preparing to give the baby the breast. "But give me him quickly, oh nurse. How tiresome you are. There, tie the cap afterwards, do." The baby's greedy scream was passing into sobs. "But you can't manage so, ma'am," said Agafia Mihailovna, who was almost always to be found in the nursery. "He must be put straight." "Oh," she chanted over him, paying no attention to the mother. The nurse brought the baby to his mother. Agafia Mihailovna followed him with a face dissolving with tenderness. He knows me in God's faith. "Katrina Alexandrovna, ma'am, he knew me," Agafia Mihailovna cried above the baby screams. But Kitty did not hear her words. Her impatience kept growing like the baby's. Their impatience hindered things for a while. The baby could not get hold of the breast right, and was furious at last. After despairing, breathless screaming and vain sucking, things went right, and mother and child felt simultaneously soothed, and both subsided into calm. "But poor darling, he's all in perspiration," said Kitty in a whisper, touching the baby. "What makes you think he knows you?" she added with a sidelong glance at the baby's eyes that appeared roguishly, as she fancied from under his cap at his rhythmically puffing cheeks and a little red-palmed hand he was waving. "Impossible. If he knew anyone, he would have known me," said Kitty in response to Agafia Mihailovna's statement. And she smiled, because though she said he could not know her, in her heart she was sure that he knew not merely Agafia Mihailovna, but that he knew and understood everything, and knew and understood a great deal too that no one else knew, and that she, his mother, had learned and come to understand only through him. To Agafia Mikhailovna, to the nurse, to his grandfather, to his father, even Mateo was a living being requiring only material care. But for his mother he had long been a mortal being, with whom there had been a whole series of spiritual relations already. "When he wakes up, please God, you shall see for yourself. Then when I do like this, he simply beams on me. The darling simply beams like a sunny day," said Agafia Mihailovna. Well, then we shall see," whispered Kitty. "And now go away, he's going to sleep." Chapter 7. Agafia Mikhailovna went out on tiptoe. The nurse let down the blind, chased a fly out from under the muslin canopy of the crib, Bumblebee struggling on the window frame, and sat down waving a faded branch of birch over the mother. And the baby, how hard it is, if God would send a drop of rain. She said yes, yes was all Kitty answered, rocking a little and tenderly squeezing the plump little arm with rolls of fat, the wrist which Mitya still waved feebly as he opened and shut his eyes. That hand worried Kitty. She longed to kiss the little hand, but was afraid to for fear of waking the baby at last. The little hand ceased waving, and the eyes closed only from time to time. As he went on sucking, the baby raised his long curly eyelashes and peeped at his mother with wet eyes that looked black in the twilight. The nurse had left off fanning and was dozing. From above came the peals of the old prince's voice and the chuckle of Katavaso. They've gotten to talk without me, thought Kitty, but still it's fixing. The cost is out. He should have gone to the bee house again, though it's pity he's there so often still. I'm glad it distracts his mind. He's become altogether happier and better now than in the spring. I used to be so gloomy and worried that I felt frightened for him, and how absurd he is, she whispered, smiling. She knew what worried her husband. It was his unbelief, although if she had been asked whether she supposed that in the future life, if he did not believe, he would be damned, she would have had to admit that he would be damned. His unbelief did not cause her unhappiness, and she confessing that for an unbeliever there can be no salvation, and loving her husband's soul more than anything in the world, fought with a smile of his unbelief and told herself that he was absurd. What does he keep reading? Philosophy of some sort for all this year. She wondered if it's all written in those books he can understand them. If it's all wrong, why does he read them? He says himself that he'd like to believe, then why is it he doesn't believe? Surely from his thinking so much, and he thinks so much from being solitary. He's always alone. He can't talk about it all to us. I fancy he'll be glad if these visitors, especially Katavasov, he likes discussions with them, she thought, and passed instantly to the consideration of where it would be more convenient to put Katavasov to sleep alone or to share Sergei Ivanovich's room. And then an idea suddenly struck her which made her shudder and even disturb Mitya, who glanced severely at her. I do believe the laundress hasn't sent the washing yet, and all the best sheets are in use. If I don't see to it, Agafia Mikhailovna will give Sergei Ivanovich the wrong sheets. And at the very idea of this, the blood rushed to Kitty's face. Yes, I will arrange it, she decided, and going back to her former thoughts, she remembered that some spiritual question of importance had been interrupted, and she began to recall what Costa, an unbeliever, she thought again with a smile. Well, an unbeliever, then better let him always be one than like Madame Stahl, or what I tried to be in those days abroad. No, he won't ever sham anything. In a recent instance of his goodness rose vividly to her mind a fortnight ago. A penitent letter had come from Stepan Herkatovich to Dolly. He besought her to save his honor, to sell her estate, to pay his debts. Dolly was in despair. She detested her husband, despised him, pitied him, resolved on a separation, resolved to refuse, but ended by agreeing to sell part of her property. After that, with an irrepressible smile of tenderness, Kitty recalled her husband's shame-faced embarrassment, his repeated awkward efforts to approach the subject, and how at last, having thought of the one means of helping Dolly without wounding her pride, he had suggested to Kitty what had not occurred to her before, that she should give up her share of the property. He, an unbeliever indeed, with his heart his dread of offending anyone, even a child, everything for others, nothing for himself. Sergei Ivanovich simply considers it has cost his duty to be his steward. And it's the same with his sister now. Dolly and her children are under his guardianship. All these peasants who come to him every day, as though he were bound to be at their service. Yes, only be like your father, only like him, she said, handing me over to the nurse and putting her lips to his cheek. Chapter 8. Ever since by his beloved brother's deathbed, Levin had first glanced into the questions of life and death in the light of these new convictions, as he called them, which had during the period from his 20th to his 34th year imperceptibly replaced his childish and youthful beliefs. He had been stricken with horror, not so much of death as of life, without any knowledge of whence and why and how and what it was. The physical organization, its decay, the indestructibility of matter, the law of the conservation of energy, evolution, were the words which usurped the place of his old belief. These words and the ideas associated with them were very well for intellectual purposes. But for life they yielded nothing, and Levin felt suddenly like a man who has changed his warm fur cloak for a muslin garment, and going for the first time into the frost is immediately convinced not by reason, but by his whole nature, that he is as good as naked, and that he must infallibly perish. Miserably from that moment, though he did not distinctly face it, and still went on living as before, Levin had never lost the sense of terror at his lack of knowledge. He vaguely felt too that what he called his new convictions were not merely lack of knowledge, but that they were part of a whole order of ideas in which no knowledge of what he needed was possible. At first, marriage with the new joys and duties bound up with it had completely crowded out these thoughts, but of late, while he was staying in Moscow, after his wife's confinement with nothing to do, the question that clamored for solution had more and more often, more and more insistently haunted Levin's mind. The question was summed up for him thus: if I do not accept the answers Christianity gives to the problems of my life, what answers do I accept? And in the whole arsenal of his convictions, so far from finding any satisfactory answers, he was utterly unable to find anything at all like an answer. He was in the position of a man seeking food and toy shops and tool shops instinctively, unconsciously. With every book, with every conversation, with every man he met, he was on the lookout for light on these questions and their solution. What puzzled and distracted him above everything was that the majority of men of his age and circle had, like him, exchanged their old beliefs for the same new convictions, and yet saw nothing to lament in this, and were perfectly satisfied and serene, so that apart from the principal question, Levin was tortured by other questions. Were these people sincere, he asked himself, or were they playing a part? Or was it that they understood the answers science gave to these problems in some different, clearer sense than he did? And he assiduously studied both these men's opinions and the books which treated of these scientific explanations. One fact he'd found out since these questions had engrossed his mind was that he had been quite wrong in supposing, from the recollections of the circle of his young days at college, that religion had outlived its day, and that it was now practically non-existent. All people nearest to him who were good in their lives were believers. The old prince and love of whom he liked so much, and Sergei Ivanovich, and all the women believed, and his wife believed as simply as he had believed in his earliest childhood, and 99 hundreds of the Russian people, all the working people for whose life he felt the deepest respect, believed. Another fact of which he became convinced after reading many scientific books was that the men who shared his views had no other construction to put on them, and that they gave no explanation of the questions which he felt he could not live without answering, but simply ignored their existence and attempted to explain other questions of no possible interest to him, such as the evolution of organisms, the materialistic theory of consciousness, and so forth. Moreover, during his wife's confinement, something had happened that seemed extraordinary to him. He, an unbeliever, had fallen into praying, and at the moment he prayed he believed, but that moment had passed, and he could not make his state of mind at that moment fit into the rest of his life. He could not admit that at that moment he knew the truth, and that now he was wrong, for as soon as he began thinking calmly about it, it all fell to pieces. He could not admit that he was mistaken then, for his spiritual condition then was precious to him, and to admit that it was a proof of weakness would have been to desecrate those moments. He was miserably divided against himself, and strained all of his spiritual forces to the utmost to escape from this condition. Chapter 9. These doubts fretted and harassed him, growing weaker or stronger from time to time, but never leaving him. He read and thought, and the more he read and the more he thought, the further he felt from the aim he was pursuing of late in Moscow and in the country. Since he had become convinced that he would find no solution in the materialists, he had read and reread thoroughly Plato, Spinoza, Kant, Schelling, Hegel, and Schopenhauer, the philosophers who gave a non-materialistic explanation of life. Their ideas seemed to him fruitful when he was reading, or was himself seeking arguments to refute other theories, especially those of the materialists. But as soon as he began to read or sought for himself a solution of problems, the same thing always happened, as long as he followed the fixed definition of obscure words, such as spirit, will, freedom, essence, purposely letting himself go into the snare of words the philosopher set for him. He seemed to comprehend something, but he had only to forget the artificial train of reasoning and to turn from life itself to what had satisfied him while thinking in accordance with the fixed definitions, and all this artificial edifice fell to pieces at once like a house of cards. And it became clear that the edifice had been built up out of those transposed words apart from anything in life more important than reason. At one time reading Schopenhauer, he put in place of his will the word love. And for a couple of days this new philosophy charmed him till he removed a little away from it. But then, when he turned from life itself to glance at it again, it fell away too and proved to be the same muslin garment with no warmth in it. His brother Sergei Ivanovich advised him to read the theological works of Hemyakov. Levin read the second volume of Hemyakov's works, and in spite of the elegant epigrammatic argumentative style, which at first repelled him, he was impressed by the doctrine of the Church he found in them. He was struck at first by the idea that the apprehension of divine truths had not been vouchsafed to man, but to a corporation of men bound together by love to the Church. What delighted him was the thought how much easier it was to believe in a still existing living Church embracing all the beliefs of men and having God at its head, and therefore holy and infallible, and from it to accept the faith in God in the creation, the fall, the redemption, than to begin with God, a mysterious faraway God, the creation, etc. But afterwards, on reading a Catholic writer's history of the Church, and then a Greek Orthodox writer's history of the Church, and seeing that the two churches in their very conception infallible each deny the authority of the other, Hemyakov's doctrine of the Church lost all its charm for him, and this edifice crumbled into dust like the philosopher's edifices. All that spring he was not himself, and went through fearful moments of horror, without knowing what I am and why I'm here. Life's impossible, and that I can't know, and so I can't live. Levin said to himself, in infinite time, in infinite matter, in infinite space is formed a bubble organism, and that bubble lasts a while and bursts, and that bubble is me. It was an agonizing error, but it was the sole logical result of ages of human thought in that direction. This was the ultimate belief on which all the systems elaborated by human thought in almost all their ramifications rested. It was the prevalent conviction, and of all other explanations Levin had, unconsciously, not knowing when or how, chosen it as anyway the clearest and made it his own. But it was not merely a falsehood, it was the cruel gare of some wicked power, some evil hateful power to whom one could not submit. He must escape from this power, and the means of escape every man had in his own hands. He had but to cut short this dependence on evil, and there was one means: death. And Levin, a happy father and husband in perfect health, was several times so near suicide that he had the cord that he might not be tempted to hang himself, and was afraid to go out with his gun for fear of shooting himself. But Levin did not shoot himself and did not hang himself. He went on living. Chapter 10. When Levin thought what he was and what he was living for, he could find no answer to the questions and was reduced to despair. But he left off questioning himself about it. It seemed as though he knew both what he was and for what he was living for. He acted and lived resolutely and without hesitation. Indeed, in these later days, he was far more decided and unhesitating in life than he had ever been when he went back to the country. At the beginning of June, he went back also to his usual pursuits: the management of the estate, his relations with the peasants and the neighbors, the care of his household, the management of his sisters' and brothers' property, of which he had the direction, his relations with his wife and kindred, the care of his child, and the new beekeeping hobby he had taken up that spring filled all his time. These things occupied him now, not because he justified them to himself by any sort of general principles, as he had done in former days. On the contrary, disappointed by the failure of his former efforts for the general welfare, and too much occupied with his own thought and the mass of business with which he was burdened from all sides, he'd completely given up thinking of the general good. And he busied himself with all of his work simply because it seemed to him that he must do what he was doing, that he could not do otherwise. In former days, almost from childhood and increasingly up to full manhood, when he had tried to do anything that would be good for all, for humanity, for Russia, for the whole village, he had noticed that the idea of it had been pleasant, but the work itself had always been incoherent, that then he had never had a full conviction of its absolute necessity, and that the work that had begun by seeming so great had grown less and less till it vanished into nothing. But now, since his marriage, when he had begun to confine himself more and more to living for himself, though he experienced no delight at all at the thought of the work he was doing, he felt a complete conviction of its necessity, saw that it succeeded far better than in old days, and that it kept on growing more and more. Now involuntarily, it seemed he cut more and more deeply into the soil like a plow, so that he could not be drawn out without turning aside the furrow, to live the same family life as his father and forefathers, that is, in the same condition of culture, and to bring up his children in the same, was incontestably necessary. It was as necessary as dining when one was hungry, and to do this just as it was necessary to cook dinner. It was necessary to keep the mechanism of agriculture Pakrovska going so as to yield an income. Just as incontestably as it was necessary to repay a debt, was it necessary to keep the property in such a condition that his son, when he received it as a heritage, would say thank you to his father as Levin had said thank you to his grandfather for all he built and planted. And to do this, it was necessary to look after the land himself, not to let it, and to breed cattle, manure the fields, and plant timber. It was impossible not to look after the affairs of Sergei Ivanovich, of his sister, of the peasants who came to him for advice and were accustomed to do so, as impossible as to fling down a child one is carrying in one's arms. It was necessary to look after the comfort of his sister-in-law and her children, and of his wife and baby, and it was impossible not to spend with them at least a short time each day. And all this, together with shooting and his new beekeeping, filled up the whole of Levin's life, which had no meaning at all for him when he began to think. But besides knowing thoroughly what he had to do, Levin knew, and just the same way, how he had to do it all. And what was more important than the rest, he knew he must hire laborers as cheaply as possible, but to hire men under bond, paying them in advance at less than the current rate of wages, was what he must not do, even though it was very profitable. Selling straw to the peasants in times of scarcity of provender was what he might do, even though he felt sorry for them. But the tavern and the pothouse must be put down. Though they were source of income, felling timber must be punished as severely as possible. But he could not exact forfeits for cattle being driven onto his fields, and though it annoyed the keeper and made the peasants not afraid to graze their cattle on his land, he could not keep their cattle as a punishment. To Peter, who was paying a money lender 10% a month, he must lend some of money to set him free, but he could not let off peasants who did not pay their rent nor let them fall into her arrears. It was impossible to overlook the bailiffs not having mown the meadows and letting the hay spoil. And it was equally impossible to mow those acres where young copse had been planted. It was impossible to excuse a laborer who had gone home in the busy season because his father was dying, however sorry he might feel for him, and he must subtract from his pay those costly months of idleness. But it was impossible not to allow monthly rations to the old servants who were of no use for anything. Levin knew that when he got home he must first of all go to his wife, who was unwell, and that the peasants who had been waiting for 3 hours to see him could wait a little longer. He knew, too, that regardless of all the pleasure he felt in taking a swarm, he must forego that pleasure and leave the old man to see the bees alone while he talked to the peasants who would come after him to the bee house. Whether he were acting rightly or wrongly he did not know, and far from trying to prove that he was, nowadays he avoided all thought or talk about it. Reasoning had brought him to doubt and prevented him from seeing what he ought to do and what he ought not. When he did not think, but simply lived, he was continually aware of the presence of an infallible judge in his soul, determining which of two possible courses of action was the better and which was the worse. And as soon as he did not act rightly, he was at once aware of it. So he lived not knowing and not seeing any chance of knowing what he was and what he was living for, and harassed at this lack of knowledge to such a point that he was afraid of suicide, and yet firmly laying down his own individual definite path in life. Chapter 11. The day on which Sergei Ivanovich came to Pokrovska was one of Levin's most painful days. It was the very busiest working time, when all the peasantry show An extraordinary intensity of self-sacrifice and labor, such as is never shown in any other conditions of life, and would be highly esteemed. The men who showed these qualities themselves thought highly of them, and if it were not repeated every year, and if the results of this intense labor were not so simple to reap and bind the rye and oats, and to carry it, to mow the meadows, turn over the fallows, thrash the seed, and sow the winter corn, all this seems so simple and ordinary. But to succeed in getting through it all, everyone in the village, from the old man to the young child, must toil incessantly for 3 or 4 weeks, 3 times, as hard as usual, living on rye, beer, onions, and black bread, thrashing and carrying the sheaves at night, and not giving more than 2 or 3 hours in the 24 to sleep. And every year this is done all over Russia, having lived the greater part of his life in the country, and in the closest relations with the peasants. Levin always felt in this busy time that he was infected by this general quickening of energy in the people. In the early morning he rode over to the first sowing of the rye, and to the oats, which were being carried to the stacks, and returning home at the time his wife and sister-in-law were getting up, he drank coffee with them and walked to the farm, where a new thrashing machine was to be set working, to get ready to seed corn. He was standing in the cool granary still, fragrant with the leaves of the hazel branches interlaced on the freshly peeled aspen beams of the new thatch roof. He gazed through the open door, in which the dry bitter dust of the thrashing whirled, and played at the grass of the thrashing floor in the sunlight, and the fresh straw that had been brought in from the barn, then at the speckly-headed white-breasted swallows that flew chirping in under the roof and fluttering their wings settled in the crevices of the doorway, then at the peasants bustling in the dark, dusty barn. And he thought strange thoughts. Why is it all being done? He thought, why am I standing here, making them work? What are they all so busy for, trying to show their zeal before me? What is that old Matrona, my old friend, toiling for? I doctored her when the beam fell on her in the fire, he thought, looking at a thin old woman who was raking up the grain, moving painfully, with her bare sun-blackened feet, over the uneven rough floor. Then she recovered, but today or tomorrow or in 10 years she won't. They'll bury her, and nothing will be left either of her or that smart girl in the red jacket who with that skillful soft action shakes the ears out of their husks. They'll bury her and this piebald horse, and very soon too, he thought, gazing at the heavily moving, panting horse that kept walking up the wheel that turned under him. And they will bury her and Theodore the thrasher with his curly beard full of chaff, and his shirt torn on his white shoulders. They will bury him. He's untying the sheaves and giving orders and shouting to the women and quickly setting straight the strap on the moving wheel. And what's more, it's not them alone, me they'll bury too, and nothing will be left. What for? He thought this, and at the same time looked at his watch to reckon how much they thrashed in an hour. He wanted to know this so as to judge by it the task to set for the day. It'll soon be won, and there only beginning the third chief, thought 11. He went up to the man that was feeding the machine, and shouting over the roar of the machine, he told him to put it in more slowly. You put in too much at a time, Theodore. Do you see it gets choked? That's why it isn't getting on. Do it evenly. Theodore, black with the dust that clung to his moist face, shouted something in response, but still went on doing it, as Levin did not want him to. Levin, going up to the machine, moved. Theodore sighed and began feeding the corn and himself working on till the peasants' dinner hour, which was not long in coming. He went out of the barn with Theodore and fell into talk with him, stopping beside a neat yellow sheep of rye laid on the thrashing floor for seed. Theodore came from a village at some distance from the one in which Levin had once allotted land to his cooperative association. Now it had been led to a former house porter. Levin talked to Theodore about this land and asked whether Platon, a well-to-do peasant of good character belonging to the same village, would not take the land for the coming year. It's a high rent. It wouldn't pay Platon. Konstantin Dmitrovich answered the peasant, picking the ears off his sweat-drenched shirt. But how does Kirilov make it pay, Meteor? So the peasant called the house porter in a tone of contempt. You may be sure he'll make it pay, Konstantin Dmitrievich. He'll get his share, however he has to squeeze to get it. He's no mercy on a Christian, but uncle for carnage. So he called the old peasant Platon. Do you suppose he'd flay the skin off a man? Where there's debt he'll let anyone off, and he'll not wring the last penny out. He's a man too. But why will he let anyone off? Well, of course folks are different. One man lives for his own wants and nothing else. Like media, he only thinks of filling his belly. But for carnage is a righteous man. He lives for his soul. He does not forget God. How thinks of God? How does he live for his soul? Levin almost shouted. Why, to be sure, in truth, in God's way, folks are different. Take you now, you wouldn't wrong a man. Yes, yes, goodbye, said Levin, breathless with excitement, and turning around. He took his stick and walked quickly away towards home. At the peasant's words, that Falcone lived for his soul, in truth, in God's way, undefined, but significant ideas seemed to burst out as though they had been locked up and all striving towards one goal. They thronged, whirling through his head, blinding him with their light. Chapter 12. Levin strode along the high road, absorbed not so much in his thoughts. He could not yet disentangle them as in his spiritual condition, unlike anything he had experienced before. The words uttered by the peasant had acted on his soul, like an electric shock, suddenly transforming and combining into a single whole, the whole swarm of disjointed, impotent, separate thoughts that incessantly occupied his mind. These thoughts had unconsciously been in his mind. Even when he was talking about the land, he was aware of something new in his soul and joyfully tested this new thing, not yet knowing what it was, not living for his own wants, but for God. For what God? And could one say anything more senseless than what he said? He said that one must not live for one's own wants. That is, one must not live for what we understand, what we are attracted by, what we desire, but must live for something incomprehensible, for God, whom no one can understand nor even define. What of it? Didn't I understand those senseless words of Theodore's, and understanding them, that I doubt of their truth, that I think them stupid, obscure, and exact? No, I understood him, and exactly as he understands the words, I understood them more fully and clearly than I understand anything in life, and never in my life have I doubted, nor can I doubt about it. And not only I, but everyone. The whole world understands nothing fully but this, and about this only they have no doubts, and are always agreed. And I looked out for miracles, complained that I did not see a miracle which would convince me. A material miracle would have persuaded me. And here is a miracle, the sole miracle possible, continually existing, surrounding me on all sides, and I never noticed it. Theodore says that Kirillov lives for his belly. That's comprehensible and rational. All of us is rational. Beings can't do anything else but live for our belly, and all of a sudden the same Theodore says that one mustn't live for one's belly, but must live for truth, for God. And at a hint I understand him, and I and millions of men who lived ages ago, and men living now, peasants, the poor in spirit, and the learned, who have thought and written about it in their obscure words, saying the same thing. We're all agreed about this one thing, what we must live for, and what is good. I and all men have only one firm, incontestable, clear knowledge, and that knowledge cannot be explained by reason. It is outside it, and has no causes, and can have no effects. If goodness has causes, it is not goodness. If it has effects or reward, it is not goodness either. So goodness is outside the chain of cause and effect, and yet I know it, and we all know it. What could be a greater miracle than that? Can I have found the solution of it all? Can my sufferings be over? Thought Levin, striding along the dusty road, not noticing the heat nor his weariness, and experiencing a sense of relief from prolonged suffering. This feeling was so delicious that it seemed to him incredible. He was breathless with emotion and incapable of going farther. He turned off the road into the forest and lay down in the shade of an aspen on the uncut grass. He took his hat off his hot head and lay propped on his elbow in the lush, feathery woodland grass. Yes, I must make it clear to myself and understand, he thought, looking intently at the untrampled grass before him and following the movements of a green beetle advancing along a blade of couch grass and lifting up in its progress a leaf of goatweed. What have I discovered? He asked himself, bending aside the leaf of goatweed out of the beetle's way and twisting another blade of grass above for the beetle to cross over onto it. What is it makes me glad? What have I discovered? I have discovered nothing. I've only found out what I knew. I understand the force that in the past gave me life, and now to gives me life. I've been set free from falsity. I found the master of old. I used to say that in my body, that in the body of this grass, And of this beetle there she didn't care for the grass. She's opened her wings and flown away. There was going on a transformation of matter in accordance with physical, chemical, and physiological laws, and in all of us, as well as in the aspens, and the clouds, and the misty patches. There was a process of evolution, from what into what, eternal evolution and struggle, as though there could be any sort of tendency and struggle in the eternal. And I was astonished that in spite of the utmost effort of thought along that road, I could not discover the meaning of life, the meaning of my impulses and yearnings. Now I say that I know the meaning of my life, to live for God, for my soul. And this meaning, in spite of its clearness, is mysterious. And marvelous such indeed is the meaning of everything existing. Yes, pride, he said to himself, turning over on his stomach and beginning to tie a noose of blades of grass, trying not to break them. And not merely pride of intellect, but dullness of intellect, and most of all the deceitfulness, yes, the deceitfulness of intellect, the cheating knavishness of intellect. That's it, he said to himself. And he briefly went through mentally the whole course of his ideas during the last 2 years, the beginning of which was the clear confronting of death at the sight of his dear brother hopelessly ill, then for the first time grasping that for every man, and himself too, there was nothing in store but suffering, death, and forgetfulness. He had made up his mind that life was impossible like that, and that he must either interpret life so that it would not present itself to him as the evil jest of some devil, or shoot himself. But he had not done either, but had gone on, living, thinking, and feeling, and even at that very time married, and had many joys, and had been happy when he was not thinking of the meaning of his life. What did this mean? It meant that he had been living rightly, but thinking wrongly. He had lived without being aware of it on those spiritual truths that he had sucked in with his mother's milk. But he had thought not merely without recognition of these truths, but studiously ignoring them. Now it was clear to him that he could only live by virtue of the beliefs in which he had been brought up. What should I have been, and how should I have spent my life, if I had not had these beliefs? If I had not known that I must live for God and not for my own desires, I should have robbed and lied and killed. Nothing of what makes the chief happiness of my life would have existed for me, and with the utmost stretch of imagination, he could not conceive the brutal creature he would have been himself if he had not known what he was living for. I looked for an answer to my question, and thought could not give an answer to my question. It was incommensurable with my question. The answer had been given me by life itself, and my knowledge of what is right and what is wrong, and that knowledge I did not arrive at in any way. It was given to me as to all men given, because I could not have got it from anywhere. Where could I have got it? By reason could I have arrived at knowing that I must love my neighbor and not oppress him. I was told that in my childhood, and I believed it gladly, for they told me what was already in my soul. But who discovered it? Not reason. Reason discovered the struggle for existence, and the law that requires us to oppress all who hinder the satisfaction of our desires. That's the deduction of reason. But loving one's neighbor, reason could never discover, because it's irrational. Chapter 13. And Levin remembered a scene he had lately witnessed between Dolly and her children. The children left themselves, had begun cooking raspberries over the candles and squirting milk into each other's mouths with a syringe. Their mother, catching them at these pranks, began reminding them Levin's presence of the trouble their mischief gave to the grown-up people, and that this trouble was all for their sake, and that if they smashed the cups, they'd have nothing to drink their tea out of, and that if they wasted the milk, they would have nothing to eat and die of hunger. And Levin had been struck by the passive, weary incredulity with which the children heard what their mother said to them. They were simply annoyed that their amusing play had been interrupted, and did not believe a word of what their mother was saying. They could not believe it indeed, for they could not take in the immensity of all they habitually enjoyed, and so could not conceive that what they were destroying was the very thing they lived by. That all comes of itself, they thought, and there's nothing interesting or important about it, because it's always been so and always will be so, and it's all always the same, with no need to think about that. It's already, but we want to invent something of our own, and knew, so we thought of putting raspberries in a cup and cooking them over a candle and squirting milk straight into each other's mouths. That's fun and something new and not a bit worse than drinking out of cups. Isn't it just the same that we do that I did, searching by the aid of reason for the significance of the forces of nature and the meaning of the life of man, he thought, and don't all the theories of philosophy do the same, trying by the path of thought, which is strange and not natural to man, to bring him to a knowledge of what he has known long ago and knows so certainly that he could not live at all without it. Isn't it distinctly to be seen in the development of each philosopher's theory that he knows what is the chief significance of life beforehand, just as positively as the peasant Theodore, and not a bit more clearly than he, and is simply trying by a dubious intellectual path to come back to what everyone knows now, then leave the children to themselves to get things alone, and make their crockery get the milk from the cows, and so on. Would they be naughty? Then why they die of hunger? Well, then leave us with our passions and thoughts. Without any idea of the one God of the Creator, or without any idea of what is right, without any idea of moral evil, just try and build up anything without those ideas. We only try to destroy them, because we're spiritually provided for, exactly like the children. Whence have I that joyful knowledge shared with the peasant that alone gives peace to my soul? Whence did I get it? Brought up with an idea of God, a Christian, my whole life filled with the spiritual blessings Christianity has given me, full of them, and living on those blessings like the children. I did not understand them and destroy, that is, try to destroy what I live by. And as soon as an important moment of life comes, like the children, when they're cold and hungry, I turn to him, and even less than the children, when their mother scolds them for their childish mischief, do I feel that my childish efforts at want and madness are reckoned against me. Yes, what I know not by reason, but it has been given to me, revealed to me, and I know it with my heart, by faith in the chief thing taught by the church. The church, Levin repeated to himself. He turned over on the other side, and leaning on his elbow felt a gazing into the distance at a herd of cattle crossing over to the river. But can I believe in all the church teaches? He thought, trying himself and thinking of everything that could destroy his present peace of mind. Intentionally he recalled all those doctrines of the church which had always seemed most strange and had always been a stumbling block to him, the creation. But how did I explain existence? By nothing, the devil and sin. But how do I explain evil? The atonement. But I know nothing, and I can know nothing but what has been told to me and all men. And it seemed to him that there was not a single article of faith of the church which could destroy the chief thing, faith in God, in goodness as the one goal of man's destiny. Under every article of faith of the church could be put the faith in the service of truth instead of one's desires, and each doctrine did not simply leave that faith unshaken. Each doctrine seemed essential to complete that great miracle continually manifest upon earth that made it possible for each man and millions of different sorts of men, wise men and imbeciles, old men and children, all men, peasants, level of kitty, beggars and kings, to understand perfectly the same one thing, and to build up thereby that life of the soul which alone is worth living, and which alone is precious to us. Lying on his back, he gazed up now into the high cloudless sky. Do I not know that that is infinite space, and that it is not a round arch? But however I screw up my eyes and strain my sight, I cannot see it, not round and not bounded, and in spite of my knowing about infinite space, I am incontestably right when I see a solid blue dome, and more right than when I strain my eyes to see beyond it. Levin ceased thinking, and only as it were listened to mysterious voices that seemed talking joyfully and earnestly within him. Can this be faith? He thought, afraid to believe in his happiness. My God, I thank thee, he said, gulping down his sobs, and with both hands brushing away the tears that filled his eyes. Chapter 14. Levin looked before him and saw a herd of cattle. Then he caught sight of his trap with Raven in the shafts, and the coachman, who driving up to the herd said something to the herdsman. Then he heard the rattle of the wheels and the snort of the sleek horse close by him. But he was so buried in his thoughts that he did not even wonder why the coachman had come for him. He only thought of that when the coachman had driven quite up to him. and shouted to him, "The mistress sent me, your brother has come, and some gentleman with him." Levin got into the trap and took the reins. Though just roused out of sleep for a long while, Levin could not collect his faculties. He stared at the sleek horse flecked with lather between his haunches, and on his neck where the harness rubbed, stared at Ivan the coachman sitting beside him, and remembered that he was expecting his brother, thought that his wife was most likely uneasy at his long absence, and tried to guess who was the visitor, had come with his brother, and his wife, and the unknown guest seemed to him now quite different from before. He fancied that now his relations with all men would be different. With my brother there will be none of that aloofness there always used to be between us. There will be no disputes with Kitty. There shall never be quarrels with the visitor, whoever he may be. I will be friendly and nice with the servants. With Ivan it will all be different, pulling the stiff rein and holding in the good horse that snorted with impatience and seemed begging to be let go. Levin looked round at Ivan sitting beside him, not knowing what to do, with his unoccupied hand continually pressing down his shirt as it puffed out. And he tried to find something to start a conversation about with him. He would have said that Ivan had pulled the saddle girth up too high, but that was like blame. And he longed for friendly, warm talk. Nothing else occurred to him. "Your honor must keep to the right in mind that stump," said the coachman, pulling the rein. Levin held. "Please don't touch and don't teach me," said Levin, angered by this interference. Now, as always, interference made him angry, and he felt sorrowfully at once how mistaken had been his supposition that his spiritual condition could immediately change him in contact with reality. He was not a quarter of a mile from home when he saw Grisha and Tanya running to meet him. Uncle Kostya, Mama's coming, and grandfather, and Sergei Ivanovich, and someone else, they said, clambering up into the trap. "Who is he? An awfully terrible person, and he does like this with his arms," said Tanya, getting up in the trap and mimicking Katavaso of old or young, asked Levin, laughing, reminded of someone he did not know whom by Tanya's performance. "Oh, I hope it's not a tiresome person," thought Levin. As soon as he turned at the bend in the road and saw the party coming, Levin recognized Katavaso in a straw hat walking along swinging his arms, just as Tanya had shown him. Katavaso was very fond of discussing metaphysics, having derived his notions from natural science writers who had never studied metaphysics, and in Moscow Levin had had many arguments with him late, and one of these arguments, in which Katavaso had obviously considered that he came off victorious, was the first thing Levin thought of as he recognized him. "No, whatever I do, I won't argue and give utterance to my ideas lightly," he thought, getting out of the trap and greeting his brother in Katavasov. Levin asked about his wife. "She is taking Meteor to Kolak, a copse near the house. She meant to have him out there because it's so hot indoors at Dolly." Levin had always advised his wife not to take the baby to the wood, thinking it unsafe, and he was not pleased to hear this. "She rushes about from place to place with him," said the prince, smiling. "I advised her to try putting him in the ice cellar. She meant to come to the bee house. She thought you'd be there. We're going there," said Dolly. "Well, and what are you doing?" said Sergei Ivanovich, falling back from the rest and walking beside him. "Oh, nothing special, busy as usual with the land," answered Levin. "Well, and what about you? Come for long? We've been expecting you for such a long time." "Only for a fortnight. I have a great deal to do in Moscow." At these words the brothers' eyes met, and Levin, in spite of the desire he always had stronger than ever just now to be unaffectionate and still more open terms with his brother, felt an awkwardness, and looking at him he dropped his eyes and did not know what to say, casting over the subjects of conversation that would be pleasant to Sergei Ivanovich and would keep him off the subject of the Serbian War and the Slavonic question, at which he had hinted by the allusion to what he had to do in Moscow. Levin began to talk of Sergei Ivanovich's book. "Well, have there been reviews of your book?" he asked. Sergei Ivanovich smiled at the intentional character of the question. "No one is interested in that now, and I less than anyone," he said. "Just look, D. Alexandrovna, we shall have a shower," he added, pointing with the sunshade at the white rain clouds that showed above the aspen treetops, and these words were enough to re-establish again between the brothers that tone hardly hostile but chilly, which Levin had been so longing to avoid. Levin went up to Katavaso. "It was jolly of you to make up your mind to come," he said to him. "I've been meaning to a long while now. We shall have some discussion. We'll see to that. Have you been reading Spencer?" "No, I've not finished reading him," said Levin. "But I don't need him now." "How's that? That's interesting." "Why so?" "I mean that I'm fully convinced that the solution of the problems that interest me I shall never find in him." And as like now the Katavas of serene and good-humored expression suddenly struck him, and he felt such tenderness for his own happy mood, which he was unmistakably disturbing by this conversation, that he remembered his resolution and stopped short. "But we'll talk later on," he added. "If we're going to the bee house, it's this way along this little path," he said, addressing them. All going along the narrow path to a little uncut meadow covered on one side with thick clumps of brilliant heart's ease, among which stood up here, and their tall dark green tufts of hellebore. Levin settled his guests in the dense cool shade of the young aspens on a bench and some stumps purposely put there for visitors to the bee house who might be afraid of the bees, and he went off himself to the hut to get bread, cucumbers, and fresh honey to regale them with, trying to make his movements as deliberate as possible. And listening to the bees that buzzed more and more frequently past him, he walked along the little path to the hut. In the very entry, one bee hummed angrily, caught in his beard, but he carefully extricated it. Going into the shady outer room, he took down from the wall his veil that hung on a peg, and putting it on, and thrusting his hands into his pockets, he went into the fenced-in bee garden, where there stood in the midst of a closely mown space in regular rows fastened with vast on posts all the hives he knew so well, the old stocks, each with its own history, and along the fences the younger swarms hived that year. In front of the openings of the hives it made his eyes giddy to watch the bees and drones whirling round and round about the same spot, while among them the working bees flew in and out with spoils, or in search of them, always in the same direction, into the wood, to the flowering lime trees, and back to the hives. His ears were filled with the incessant hum in various notes, now the busy hum of the working bee quickly flying off, then the blaring of the lazy drone, and the excited buzz of the bees on guard, protecting their property from the enemy and preparing to sting on the farther side of the fence. The old beekeeper was shaving a hoop for tub, and he did not see Levin. Levin stood still in the midst of the beehives and did not call him. He was glad of a chance to be alone, to recover from the influence of ordinary actual life, which had already depressed his happy mood. He thought that he had already had time to lose his temper with Ivan, to show coolness to his brother, and to talk flippantly with Katavaso. Can it have been only a momentary mood, and it will pass and leave no trace, he thought. But at the same instant, going back to his mood, he felt with delight that something new and important had happened to him. Real life had only for a time overcast the spiritual peace he had found, but it was still untouched within him, just as the bees whirling around him, now menacing him and distracting his attention, prevented him from enjoying complete physical peace, forced him to restrain his movements to avoid them. So had the petty cares that swarmed about him from the moment he got into the trap restricted his spiritual freedom. But that lasted only so long as he was among them. Just as his bodily strength was still unaffected in spite of the bees, so too was the spiritual strength that he had just become aware of. Chapter 15. "Do you know Costa, with whom Sergei Ivanovich traveled on his way here?" said Dolly, doling out cucumbers and honey to the children. "With Vronsky. He was going to serve you, and not alone, he's taking a squadron out with him at his own expense," said Katabaso. "That's the right thing for him," said Levin. "Are volunteers still going out?" Then he added, glancing at Sergei Ivanovich. Sergei Ivanovich did not answer. He was carefully, with a blunt knife, getting a live bee covered with sticky honey out of a cup full of white honeycomb. "I should think so. You should have seen what was going on at the station yesterday," said kind of ourselves, biting a juicy sound into a cucumber. "Well, what is one to make of it? For mercy's sake, do explain to me, Sergei Ivanovich. Where are all those volunteers going? Whom are they fighting with?" asked the prince, unmistakably taking up a conversation that had sprung up in Levin's absence. "With the Turks," Sergei Ivanovich answered, smiling serenely as he extricated the bee dark with honey and helplessly kicking and put it with the knife on a stout aspen leaf. "But who has declared war on the Turks. Ivan Ivanovich Ragasov and Countess Lydia Ivanovna, assisted by Madame Stahl. No one has declared war, but people sympathize with their neighbors' sufferings and are eager to help them, said Sergei Ivanovich. But the prince is not speaking of help, said Levin, coming to the assistance of his father-in-law. Out of war, the prince says that private persons cannot take part in war without the permission of the government. Cost your mind, that's a bee. Really, they'll sting us, said Dolly, waving away a wasp. But that's not a bee, it's a wasp, said Levin. Well, what's your own theory? Kind of a sub, said Levin, with a smile distinctly challenging him to a discussion. Why have not private persons the right to do so? Well, my theory is this war is on one side, such a beastly, cruel and awful thing, that no one man, not to speak of a Christian, can individually take upon himself the responsibility of beginning wars that can only be done by a government which is called upon to do this, and is driven inevitably into war. On the other hand, both political science and common sense teach us that in matters of state, and especially in the matter of war, private citizens must forego their personal individual will. Sergei Ivanovich and Count Vaso had their replies ready and both began speaking at the same time. But the point is, my dear fellow, that there may be cases when the government does not carry out the will of the citizens, and then the public asserts its will, said Katavaso. But evidently, Sergei Ivanovich did not approve of this answer. His brows contracted at Katavasov's words, and he said something else. You don't put the matter in its true light. There is no question here of a declaration of war, but simply the expression of a human Christian feeling. Our brothers, one with us in religion and in race, are being massacred, even supposing they were not our brothers nor fellow Christians, but simply children, women, old people. Feeling is aroused and Russians go eagerly to help in stopping these atrocities. Fancy if you were going along the street and saw a drunken man beating a woman or a child. I imagine you would not stop to inquire whether war had been declared on the men, but would throw yourself on them and protect the victim. But I should not kill them, said Levin. Yes, you would kill them. I don't know. If I saw that, I might give way to my impulse of the moment. But I can't say beforehand, and such a momentary impulse there is not, and there cannot be in the case of the oppression of the Slavonic peoples. Possibly for you there is not, but for others there is, said Sergei Ivanovich, frowning with displeasure. There are traditions still extant among the people of Slavs of the true faith suffering under the yoke of the unclean sons of Hagar. The people have heard of the sufferings of their brethren, and have spoken. Perhaps so, said 11. Evasively, but I don't see it. I'm one of the people myself, and I don't feel it. Here am I to, said the old prince. I've been staying abroad and reading the papers, and I must own up to the time of the Bulgarian atrocities I couldn't make out why it was all the Russians were all of a sudden so fond of their Slavonic brethren, while I didn't feel the slightest affection for them. I was very much upset, thought I was a monster, or that it was the influence of Carlsbad on me. But since I've been here, my mindset at rest, I see that there are people besides me who are only interested in Russia and not in their Slavonic brethren. Here's Constantine. To personal opinions mean nothing in such a case, said Sergei Ivanovich. It's not a matter of personal opinions when all Russia, the whole people, has expressed its will. But excuse me, I don't see that the people don't know anything about it. If you come to that, said the old prince. Oh papa, how can you say that? And last Sunday in church, said Dolly, listening to the conversation. Please give me a cloth, she said to the old man who was looking at the children with a smile. Why, it's not possible that all. But what was it in church on Sunday? The priest had been told to read that he read it. They didn't understand a word of it. Then they were told that there was to be a collection for a pious object in church. Well, they pulled out their halfpence and gave them. But what for? They couldn't say. The people cannot help knowing the sense of their own destinies is always in the people. And at such moments as the present that sense finds utterance, said Sergei Ivanovich with conviction, glancing at the old beekeeper. The handsome old man with black grizzled beard and thick silvery hair stood motionless, holding a cup of honey, looking down from the height of his tall figure with friendly serenity at the gentlefolk, obviously understanding nothing of their conversation and not caring to understand it. That's so, no doubt, he said with a significant shake of his head at Sergei Ivanovich's words. Here, then ask him. He knows nothing about it. and thinks nothing, said Levin. Have you heard about the war my highlight? She said, turning to him. What they read in the church, what do you think about it? But we to fight for the Christians, what should we think? Alexander Nikolaevich, our emperor, has thought for us. He thinks for us indeed. In all things it's clearer for him to see. Shall I bring a bit more bread? Give the little lad some more, he said, addressing Daria Alexandrovna and pointing to Grisha, who had finished his crust. I don't need to ask, said Sergei Ivanovich. We have seen and are seeing hundreds and hundreds of people who give up everything to serve a just cause, come from every part of Russia, and directly and clearly express their thought and aim. They bring their halfpence or go themselves and say directly what for what does it mean? It means to my thinking, said Levin, who was beginning to get warm, that among 80 millions of people there can always be found not hundreds as now but tens of thousands of people who have lost caste, ne'er-dwells who are always ready to go anywhere, to Pugachev's bands, to Khiva, to Serbia. I tell you that it's not a case of hundreds or of nardwells, but the best representatives of the people, said Sergei Ivanovich with as much irritation as if he were defending the last penny of his fortune. And what of the subscriptions in this case? It is a whole people directly expressing their will. That word people is so vague, said Levin. Parish clerks, teachers, and 1 in 1,000 of the peasants maybe know what it's all about. The rest of the 80 millions, like Mihalik, far from expressing their will, haven't the faintest idea what there is for them to express their will about. What right have we to say that this is the people's will? Chapter 16. Sergei Ivanovich, being practiced in argument, did not reply, but at once turned the conversation to another aspect of the subject. Oh, if you want to learn the spirit of the people by arithmetical computation, of course, it's very difficult to arrive at it. And voting has not been introduced among us, and cannot be introduced, for it does not express the will of the people. But there are other ways of reaching that. It felt in the air, it's felt by the heart. I won't speak of those deep currents which are astir in the still ocean of the people, and which are evident to every unprejudiced man. Let us look at society in the narrow sense. All the most diverse sections of the educated public, hostile before, are merged in one. Every division is at an end. All the public organs say the same thing over and over again. All feel the mighty torrent that has overtaken them and is carrying them in one direction. Yes, all the newspapers do say the same thing, said the prince. That's true. But so it is the same thing that all the frogs croak before a storm. One can hear nothing for them. Frogs are no frogs. I'm not the editor of a paper, and I don't want to defend them. But I am speaking of the unanimity in the intellectual world, said Sergei Ivanovich, addressing his brother. Levin would have answered, but the old prince interrupted him. Well, about that unanimity, there's another thing one may say, said the prince. There's my son-in-law, Stepan Akatovich. You know him. He's got a place now on the committee of a commission, and something or other I don't remember, only there's nothing to do in it. Why, Dolly, it's no secret, and a salary of 8. Oh, you try asking him whether his post is abuse. He'll prove to you that it's most necessary, and he's a truthful man too. But there's no refusing to believe in the utility of 8,000 rubles. Yes, he asked me to give a message to Daria Alexandrovna about the post, said Sergei Ivanovich reluctantly, feeling the prince's remark to be ill-timed. So it is, but the unanimity of the press, that's been explained to me. As soon as there's war, their incomes are doubled. How can they help believing in the destinies of the people in the Slavonic races, and all that? I don't care for many of the papers, but that's unjust, said Sergei Ivanovich. I would only make one condition, pursue the old Prince Alphonse Kar, said the capital thing before the war with Prussia. You consider war to be inevitable. Very good. Let everyone who advocates war be enrolled in a special regiment of advance guards for the front of every storm, of every attack, to lead them all. A nice lot the editors would make, said Katavaso with a loud roar as he pictured the editors. He knew in this picket legion, but they'd run, said Dolly. They'd only be in the way. Oh, if they ran away, then we'd have grape shot or Cossacks with whips behind them, said the prince. But that's a joke, and a poor one too, if you'll excuse my saying so, Prince, said Sergei Ivanovich. I don't see that it was a joke. Levin was beginning, but Sergei Ivanovich interrupted him. Every member of society is called upon to do his own special work, said he, and men of thought are doing their work when they express public opinion. and the single-hearted and full expression of public opinion is the service of the press and a phenomenon to rejoice us at the same time 20 years ago. We should have been silent, but now we have heard the voice of the Russian people, which is ready to rise as one man and ready to sacrifice itself for its oppressed brethren. That is a great step and a proof of strength. But it's not only making a sacrifice, but killing Turks. Saad Levin timidly, the people make sacrifices and are ready to make sacrifices for their soul, but not for murder, he added, instinctively connecting the conversation with the ideas that had been absorbing his mind for their soul. That's the most puzzling expression for a natural science man. Do you understand what sort of thing is the soul, said Katavasov, smiling. Oh, no, by God, I haven't the faintest idea, said Katavas over the loud roar of laughter. I bring not peace, but a sword, says Christ. Sergei Ivanovich rejoined for his part, quoting as simply as though it were the easiest thing to understand the very passage that had always puzzled Levin most. That's so, no doubt, the old man repeated again. He was standing near them and responded to a chance glance turned in his direction. Ah, my dear fellow, you're defeated, utterly defeated, cried Katavasov good-humoredly. Levin reddened with fixation, not at being defeated, but at having failed to control himself, at being drawn into argument. No, I can't argue with them. He thought they were impenetrable armor, while unnaked he saw that it was impossible to convince his brother and Katavasov, and he saw even less possibility of himself agreeing with them. What they advocated was the very pride of intellect that had almost been his ruin. He could not admit that some dozens of men, among them his brother, had the right on the ground of what they were told by some hundreds of glib volunteers swarming to the capital to say that they and the newspapers were expressing the will and feeling of the people, and a feeling which was expressed in vengeance and murder. He could not admit this because he neither saw the expression of such feelings in the people among whom he was living, nor found them in himself. And he could not but consider himself one of the persons making up the Russian people, and most of all, because he, like the people, did not know and could not know what is for the general good, though he knew beyond the doubt that this general good could be attained only by the strict observance of that law of right and wrong which has been revealed to every man, and therefore he could not wish for war or advocate war for any general objects whatever. He said, as Mihalik did, and the people who had expressed their feeling in the traditional invitations of the Vorozhby princes, and rule over us gladly, we promise complete submission. All the labor, all humiliations, all sacrifices we take upon ourselves, but we will not judge and decide. And now, according to Sergei Ivanovich's account, the people had foregone this privilege that they had bought at such a costly price. He wanted to say to that if public opinion were an infallible guide, then why were not revolutions and the commune as lawful as the movement in favor of the Slavonic peoples? But these were merely thoughts that could settle nothing. One thing could be seen beyond doubt, that was that at the actual moment the discussion was irritating Sergei Ivanovich, and so it was wrong to continue it. And Levin ceased speaking and then called the attention of his guests to the fact that the storm clouds were gathering and that they had better be going home before it rained. Chapter 17. The old prince and Sergei Ivanovich got into the trap and drove off. The rest of the party hastened homewards on foot, but the storm clouds, turning white and then black, moved down so quickly that they had to quicken their pace to get home before the rain. The foremost clouds lowering, and black as soot-laden smoke rushed with extraordinary swiftness over the sky. They were still 100 paces from home, and a gust of wind had already blown up, and every second the downpour might be looked for. The children ran ahead with frightened and gleeful shrieks, Daria Alexandrovna struggling painfully with her skirts that clung around her legs, was not walking, but running, her eyes fixed on the children. The men of the party, holding their hats on, strode with long steps beside her. They were just at the steps when a big drop fell splashing on the edge of the iron guttering. The children and their elders after them ran into the shelter of the house, talking merrily. Katerina Alexandrovna Levin asked of Agafia Mihailovna, who met them with kerchiefs and rugs in the hall. "We thought she was with you," she said, "and Mitya in the copse. He must be. And the nurse with him." Levin snatched up the rugs and ran towards the copse. In that brief interval of time, the storm clouds had moved on, covering the sun so completely that it was dark as an eclipse stubbornly. As though insisting on its rights, the wind stopped Levin, and tearing the leaves and flowers off the lime trees and stripping the white birch branches into strange unseemly nakedness, it twisted everything on one side: acacias flowers, burdocks, long grass and tall treetops. The peasant girls working in the garden ran shrieking into shelter in the servants' quarters. The streaming rain had already flung its white veil over all the distant forest and half the fields close by, and was rapidly swooping down upon the copse. The wet of the rain, spurting up in tiny drops, could be smelt in the air. Holding his head bent down before him and struggling with the wind that strove to tear the wraps away from him, Levin was moving up to the copse and had just caught sight of something white behind the oak tree when there was a sudden flash. The whole earth seemed on fire, and the vault of heaven seemed crashing overhead. Opening his blinded eyes, Levin gazed through the thick veil of rain that separated him now from the copse, and to his horror, the first thing he saw was the green crest of the familiar oak tree in the middle of the copse, uncannily changing its position. Can it have been struck? Levin hardly had time to think when, moving more and more rapidly, the oak tree vanished behind the other trees, and he heard the crash of the great tree falling upon the others, the flash of lightning, the crash of thunder, and the instantaneous chill that ran through him were all merged for Lebanon. One sense of terror. My God, not on them," he said. And though he thought at once how senseless was his prayer, that they should not have been killed by the oak which had fallen, now he repeated it, knowing that he could do nothing better than utter this senseless prayer. Running up to the place where they usually went, he did not find them there. They were at the other end of the copse under an old lime tree. They were calling him to figures in dark dresses. They had been light summer dresses. When they started out, were standing bending over something. It was Kitty and the nurse. The rain was already ceasing, and it was beginning to get light when Levin reached them. The nurse was not wet on the lower part of her dress, but Kitty was drenched through, and her soaked clothes clung to her. Though the rain was over, they still stood in the same position in which they had been standing when the storm broke. They both stood over a perambulator with a green umbrella, alive, unhurt. "Thank God," he said, splashing with his soaked boots to the standing water and running up to them. Kitty's rosy face was turned towards him, and she smiled timidly under her shapeless soft hat. "Aren't you ashamed of yourself? I can't think how you can be so reckless," he said angrily to his wife. "It wasn't my fault, really. We were just meaning to go when he made such a to-do that we had to change him. We were just..." Kitty began defending herself. Mita was unharmed, dry, and still fast asleep. "Well, thank God. I don't know what I'm saying." They gathered up the baby's wet belongings. The nurse picked up the baby and carried it. Levin walked beside his wife, impenitent for having been angry. He squeezed her hand when the nurse was not looking. Chapter 18. During the whole of that day, in the extremely different conversations in which he took part only, as it were, with the top layer of his mind, in spite of the disappointment of not finding the change he expected in himself, Levin had been all the while joyfully conscious of the fullness of his heart. After the rain, it was too wet to go for a walk. Besides, the storm clouds still hung about the horizon and gathered here and there, black and thundery on the rim of the sky. The whole party spent the rest of the day in the house. No more discussions sprang up. On the contrary, after dinner, everyone was in the most amiable frame of mind. At first, Katavasov amused the ladies by his original jokes, which always pleased people on their first acquaintance with him. Then Sergei Ivanovich induced him to tell them about the very interesting observations he had made on the habits and characteristics of common houseflies and their life. Sergei Ivanovich too was in good spirits, and at tea his brother drew him on to explain his views of the future of the Eastern question, and he spoke so simply and so well that everyone listened equally. Kitty was the only one who did not hear it all. She was summoned to give me tia his bath. A few minutes after Kitty had left the room, she sent for Levin to come to the nursery, leaving his tea and regretfully interrupting the interesting conversation, and at the same time uneasily wondering why he had been sent for. As this only happened on important occasions, Levin went to the nursery, although he had been much interested in Sergei Ivanovich's views on the new epoch in history. that would be created by the emancipation of 40 millions of men of Slavonic race acting with Russia, conception quite new to him. And although he was disturbed by uneasy wonder at being sent for by Kitty, as soon as he came out of the drawing room and was alone, his mind reverted at once to the thoughts of the morning, and all the theories of the significance of the Slav element in the history of the world seemed to him so trivial compared with what was passing in his own soul, that he instantly forgot it all and dropped back into the same frame of mind that he had been in that morning. He did not, as he had done at other times, recall the whole train of thought that he did not need. He fell back at once into the feeling which had guided him, which was connected with those thoughts, and he found that feeling in his soul even stronger and more definite than before. He did not, as he had had to do with previous attempts to find comforting arguments, need to revive a whole chain of thought to find the feeling. Now, on the contrary, the feeling of joy and peace was keener than ever, and thought could not keep pace with feeling. He walked across the terrace and looked at the stars that had come out in the darkening sky, and suddenly he remembered, yes, looking at the sky, I thought that the dome that I see is not a deception. And then I thought something, I shocked facing something, he mused. But whatever it was, there can be no disproving it. I have but to think, and all will come clear. Just as he was going into the nursery, he remembered what it was he had shirked facing. It was that if the chief proof of the divinity was his revelation of what is right, how is it this revelation is confined to the Christian church alone? What relation to this revelation have the beliefs of the Buddhists, Mohammedans, who preached and did good to? It seemed to him that he had an answer to this question, but he had not time to formulate it to himself before he went into the nursery. Kitty was standing with her sleeves tucked up over the baby in the bath. Hearing her husband's footsteps, she turned towards him, summoning him to her with her smile. With one hand she was supporting the fat baby that lay floating and sprawling on its back, while with the other she squeezed the sponge over him. Come, look, look, she said. When her husband came up to her, Agathai Mihailov was right, he knows. U.S. Mitya had on that day given unmistakable, incontestable signs of recognizing all of his friends. As soon as Levin approached the bath, the experiment was tried, and it was completely successful. The cook sent for with this object bent over the baby. He frowned and shook his head disapprovingly. Kitty bent down to him. He gave her a beaming smile, propped his little hands on the sponge, and cheer up, making such a queer little contented sound with his lips that Kitty and the nurse were not alone in their admiration. Levin too was surprised and delighted. The baby was taken out of the bath, drenched with water, wrapped in towels, dried, and after a piercing scream, handed to his mother. Well, I'm glad you're beginning to love him, said Kitty to her husband when she'd settled herself comfortably in her usual place with the baby at her breast. I am so glad. It had begun to distress me. You said you had no feeling for him. No, did I say that? I only said I was disappointed. What disappointed in him? Not disappointed in him, but in my own feeling. I had expected more. I had expected a rush of new delightful emotion to come as a surprise, and then instead of that, disgust, pity. She listened attentively, looking at him over the baby, while she put back on her slender fingers the ring she had taken off while giving me to his bath, and most of all, there being far more apprehension and pity than pleasure today, after that fright during the storm. I understand how I love him. Kitty's smile was radiant. Were you very much frightened? She said. So was I too, but I feel it more now that it's over. I'm going to look at the oak. How nice Katavaso is, and what a happy day we've had all together. And you're so nice with Sergei Ivanovich. When you care to be, well, go back to them. It's always so hot and steamy here after the bath. Chapter 19. Going out of the nursery and being again alone, Levin went back at once to the thought in which there was something not clear. Instead of going into the drawing room where he heard voices, he stopped on the terrace and, leaning his elbows on the parapet, he gazed up at the sky. It was quite dark now, and in the south where he was looking there were no clouds. The storm had drifted on to the opposite side of the sky, and there were flashes of lightning and distant thunder from that quarter. Levin listened to the monotonous drip from the lime trees in the garden and looked at the triangle of stars he knew so well, and the Milky Way with its branches that ran through its midst. At each flash of lightning the Milky Way and even the bright stars vanished, But as soon as the lightning died away, they reappeared in their places, as though some hand had flung them back with careful aim. Well, what is it perplexes me, Levin said to himself, feeling beforehand that the solution of his difficulties was ready in his soul, though he did not know it yet. Yes, the one unmistakable, incontestable manifestation of the divinity is the law of right and wrong, which is coming to the world by revelation, and which I feel in myself, and in the recognition of which I don't make myself, but whether I will or not, I am made one with other men in one body of believers, which is called the Church. Well, but the Jews, the Mohammedans, the Confucians, the Buddhists, what of them? He put to himself the question he had feared to face. Can these hundreds of millions of men be deprived of that highest blessing, without which life has no meaning? He pondered a moment, but immediately corrected himself. But what am I questioning? He said to himself. I'm questioning the relation to divinity of all the different religions of all mankind. I'm questioning the universal manifestation of God to all the world with all those misty blurs. What am I about? To me individually, to my heart, has been revealed a knowledge beyond all doubt and unattainable by reason, and here I am obstinately trying to express that knowledge and reason in words. Don't I know that the stars don't move? He asked himself, gazing at the bright planet which had shifted its position up to the topmost twig of the birch tree. But looking at the movements of the stars, I can't picture to myself the rotation of the earth, and I'm right in saying that the stars move. And could the astronomers have understood and calculated anything if they had taken into account all the complicated and varied motions of the earth, all the marvelous conclusions they've reached about the distances, weights, movements, and deflections of the heavenly bodies are only founded on the apparent motions of the heavenly bodies about a stationary earth, on that very motion I see before me now, which has been so for millions of men during long ages, and was and will be always alike, and can always be trusted, and just as the conclusions of the astronomers would have been vain and uncertain if not founded on observations of the seen heavens in relation to a single meridian and a single horizon, so would my conclusions be vain and uncertain if not founded on that conception of right which has been and will be always alike for all men, which has been revealed to me as a Christian, and which can always be trusted in my soul. The question of other religions and their relations to divinity I have no right to decide, and no possibility of deciding. Oh, you haven't gone in? Then he heard Kitty's voice all at once as she came by the same way to the drawing room. What is it? You're not worried about anything? She said, looking intently at his face in the starlight. But she could not have seen his face if a flash of lightning had not hidden the stars and revealed it. In that flash she saw his face distinctly, and seeing him calm and happy, she smiled at him. She understands a thought. She knows what I'm thinking about. Shall I tell her or not? Yes, I'll tell her. But at the moment he was about to speak, she began speaking. Kostya, do something for me, she said. Go into the corner room and see if they've made it all right for Sergei Ivanovich. I can't very well see if they put the new wash stand in it. Very well, I'll go directly, said Levin, standing up and kissing her. No, I'd better not speak of it, he thought when she'd gone in before him. It's a secret for me alone, of vital importance for me, and not to be put into words. This new feeling has not changed me, has not made me happy and enlightened all of a sudden as I had dreamed. Just like the feeling for my child, there was no surprise in this, either faith or not faith. I don't know what it is, but this feeling has come just as imperceptibly through suffering and has taken firm root in my soul. I shall go on in the same way, losing my temper with Ivan the coachman, falling into angry discussions, expressing my opinions tactlessly. There will be still the same wall between the holy of holies of my soul and other people, even my wife. I shall still go on scolding her for my own terror, and being remorseful for it. I shall still be as unable to understand with my reason why I pray, and I shall still go on praying. But my life now, my whole life, apart from anything that can happen to me, every minute of it is no more meaningless as it was before, but has the positive meaning of goodness, which I have the power to put into it.